Welcome friends, come on in and get comfortable. Whether you're curled up beneath a heavy blanket, resting your head against a familiar pillow, or simply sitting quietly while the last soft evening light fades from the room, I'm glad you're here. The day has asked enough of you for now. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing urgent waiting beyond these next quiet moments, and no reason to hurry as the nighttime silence slowly settles around us. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these journeys into the past. And let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Perhaps rain is touching the windows where you live. Perhaps the streets outside have grown still, or perhaps the world around you remains softly awake. Whatever the hour, settle a little deeper, loosen your thoughts, and allow the present to become distant. Tonight, we're stepping back into a world that feels remote and unfamiliar, yet was filled with people who worried, rested, argued, ate, worked, and waited for morning much as people always have. Medieval Europe was not a single place or a single way of life. A monastery in northern England could feel very different from a village in Tuscany, and a merchant's house in Flanders had little in common with a shepherd's hut high in the mountains. Even now, historians continue to debate how widely certain habits were shared. Yet across many medieval communities, ordinary life included customs that would make a modern visitor deeply uncomfortable. And perhaps the first unsettling difference would not be blood, punishment, hunger, or disease. It would be the almost complete disappearance of privacy. The modern idea that a person should regularly be alone behind a closed door would have seemed rather strange in many medieval households. Space was expensive. Timber had to be cut and shaped. Stone walls required labour. Roofs needed beams, thatch, tiles, or slate. A separate chamber for every member of a family was a luxury far beyond most people. In a small village cottage, one room might serve as kitchen, workshop, sitting room, and sleeping place. A central fire smouldered beneath soot-dark rafters. An iron pot of pottage might remain near the embers. Its contents changed from day to day as oats, peas, onions, herbs, and scraps were added. Along the walls stood rough wooden chests, stools polished by years of use, and perhaps a table made for planks resting on trestles. When darkness came, the room simply changed its purpose. Wool blankets were unfolded, mattresses stuffed with straw, wool or dried plant material were arranged. Children, parents, servants, visiting relatives, and sometimes hired workers might sleep within the same small space. In poorer homes, several people shared the same bed. This was not automatically considered improper. A bed was valuable furniture. It could appear in wills, curtains, feather mattresses, linen sheets, and carved wooden frames were marks of prosperity. A wealthy person might spend more money on a grand bed than on many other household possessions, but even wealthy households rarely followed modern expectations of solitude. In castles and manor houses, great chambers often contained attendants. A nobleman might sleep while servants remained nearby. A noble woman could be helped undress by ladies or maids. Important people were surrounded precisely because being attended demonstrated rank. Privacy, in a curious way, could look like neglect. No one can quite agree whether medieval people felt less embarrassment than modern people, or simply learned to express embarrassment differently. The surviving records were generally written by people interested in property, religion, law, or politics, rather than the quiet discomforts of sharing a mattress with a snoring cousin. Still, household arrangements suggest that bodies were far less hidden. People dressed in front of others. They slept beside others. They became ill in crowded rooms. Women gave birth with groups of female attendants nearby. The dead might remain in the household before burial, surrounded by family and neighbours. Even private prayer could take place in rooms where others moved quietly nearby. And then there was washing. Medieval people did wash, despite the old myth that everyone simply remained permanently coated in dirt. Hands were washed before meals in many households. Monasteries had carefully organised washing practices. Towns could contain bathhouses, and wealthy homes might possess basins, jugs, cloths, and occasionally wooden bathing tubs. But washing did not always happen alone. A wooden tub required water to be carried, often bucket by bucket. The water might then be heated over a fire. Preparing a comfortable bath took labour, fuel, and time. In some households, bath water could be shared, although the frequency and order varied so widely that those who recorded such practices never fully agreed. Public bathhouses added another layer of companionship. Some were respectable places for washing and conversation, others acquired suspicious reputations. Church authorities occasionally complained about mixed bathing or improper behaviour, though repeated complaints may themselves suggest that regulations were not always obeyed. For a modern visitor, the shock might arrive in small moments: a servant entering without knocking, a relative sleeping an arm's length away, a basin being carried into a room while several people continued their conversation, a shirt changed beside the fire while someone stirred supper. There was no dramatic announcement that privacy had disappeared. It simply had never appeared in the form we recognise. The same was true of relieving oneself. In a castle, a guardrobe might consist of a stone or wooden seat built over a shaft. Waste fell downward, sometimes into a pit, sometimes into a moat, and sometimes directly against an outer wall. The narrow chamber could be cold, draughty, and unpleasantly exposed to smells rising from below. Some believed guardrobes were useful places to hang clothing because the strong odours discouraged moths. Historians still debate how widespread this practice truly was, but the association between guardrobes and stored garments appears in both language and later tradition. In towns, chamber pots were common. At night, someone waking beneath a wool blanket did not necessarily walk through dark streets in search of a secluded privy. A pot kept near the bed served the purpose. In the morning, its contents had to go somewhere. The matter of where, exactly, will become more unpleasant as our journey continues. For now, it is enough to imagine the closeness of the household. Outside, a monastery bell sounds across dark fields. The note travels above frozen hedges and bare trees, reaching cottages where shutters have been pulled closed against the night. In one room, a fire has fallen low. Red embers glow beneath pale ash. Someone turns beneath a coarse blanket. A child murmurs in sleep. An older man coughs. Straw rustles in a mattress. No one asks for silence. No one complains that another person's breathing can be heard. These are simply the sounds of a household alive through winter. Even in a noble residence, where stone corridors offered more space, rooms were rarely islands of perfect solitude. Beds could be shared by travellers of similar rank. Servants slept near doors or on pallets. Guards stood in passages. Pages and squires remained close to their masters. One lesser-known custom was the ceremonial importance of the bedchamber itself. For rulers and great nobles, access to sleeping and dressing spaces could become a political privilege. The people permitted near a lord while he dressed, prayed, or prepared for sleep were not necessarily insignificant servants. Proximity could mean trust. A modern person might lock the bedroom door to keep the world outside. A medieval noble might measure power by deciding who was allowed inside. In village life, the reasoning was simpler. People needed warmth. Bodies provided it. A winter night inside a poorly heated house could be bitterly cold. Fires consumed precious wood. Smoke lingered beneath rafters. Walls admitted drafts. Bedding became damp. Sharing a bed was practical. People might sleep partly clothed, though customs differed by period and place. Nightcaps and linen garments appear in some records and images. Fur-lined cloaks belonged mainly to those with greater means, while poorer villagers depended upon wool, straw, and closeness. It is easy to recoil from the lack of separation. Yet medieval people lived in communities built around constant presence. Work was shared, food was shared, news was heard together, church bells told everyone the hour. Market days gathered the surrounding countryside into one square. Manor courts publicly discussed disputes that modern families might consider intensely private. Marriage, birth, sickness, and death unfolded before witnesses. A person was rarely entirely unknown to neighbours. This could be suffocating. It could also be comforting. When a storm crossed the fields and rain struck the thatch, a household heard it together. When illness arrived, there were usually eyes nearby to notice. When a traveller knocked on an oak door after sunset, the entire room might look up at once. Perhaps that is the quieter truth hidden beneath habits that horrify modern sensibilities. Medieval life exposed people constantly to one another, their smells, their illnesses, their tempers, their prayers, their sleeping faces, their final breaths. There were few clean boundaries between public and private, body and household, family and community, and as the embers sank lower, people simply made space. A blanket shifted, a straw mattress creaked. Somewhere beyond the walls, wind passed slowly through the winter fields. Morning would come with bells, smoke, cold water, and muddy boots. But for a few dark hours, an entire household slept almost within reach of one another, accepting a closeness that many people today would find difficult to endure even for a single night. By morning, the same crowded household that had slept shoulder to shoulder would begin moving through a room that modern eyes might judge with almost immediate alarm. The floor was rarely a clean, polished surface. In a wealthy hall, stone flags could lie beneath tables and benches, hard and cold even in mild weather. In cottages, the floor might simply be beaten earth, packed firm by years of footsteps, spilled ale, rainwater, ash, mud, and the slow pressure of ordinary life. Over these surfaces, people often spread rushes, reeds, straw, or other plant material to soften the ground and absorb moisture. At first, fresh rushes could smell pleasantly green. They rustled beneath shoes and helped make a draughty room feel warmer. Herbs might be scattered among them: lavender, mint, sweet woodruff, tansy, or meadow sweet appear in later household traditions. Partly for fragrance, and perhaps partly because some plants were believed to discourage insects. The trouble began when the rushes were not replaced often enough. No one can quite agree how filthy the floors of an average medieval household truly became. Wealthy houses employed servants who swept and renewed floor coverings, while poorer families had fewer resources, but also lived in smaller spaces that could sometimes be cleared more easily. Moralists and satirists exaggerated dirt when it suited their arguments. Household records usually tell us what was purchased, not what was quietly decaying beneath a bench. Still, organic floor coverings created an inviting world for very small creatures. Crumbs fell from trenchers, drops of fat spilled from cooking pots. Ale soaked into the layers, mud dried and flaked from boots. Dogs shook rainwater from their coats. Bits of wool, hair, fishbone, onion peel, ash, and perhaps worse worked their way downward. Fresh rushes might be laid over older material rather than every hidden fragment being removed. And somewhere beneath that soft, fragrant upper layer, life continued. Beetles crept through the stalks. Fleas waited. Lice remained closer to the human body, hidden in hair or clothing seams, but fleas could move between bedding, floors, animals, and people with maddening ease. To medieval men and women, itching was not a rare inconvenience. It was part of bodily existence. People scratched. They picked lice from one another. Combs with very fine teeth were used to remove both lice and their eggs. Archaeologists have found combs designed with narrow teeth close enough together for exactly this purpose. Some were carved from bone, antler, or wood. A well-made comb was not merely decorative. It was a practical weapon in a battle that never entirely ended. One lesser-known practice involved delousing clothing by heat. Garments might be held near fires, aired, beaten, or sometimes placed in heated spaces where insects could be killed. The precise methods differed widely, and surviving descriptions are frustratingly incomplete. Some chroniclers claim that certain herbs or strong-smelling substances drove vermin away, though whether these remedies truly worked is another matter. A person might tuck aromatic plants into bedding. A household could burn herbs. Clothing might be washed when water, weather, fabric, and time allowed, but wool was difficult. Heavy wool garments took time to dry. In winter, damp cloth could remain cold for hours or days. Washing too frequently might damage expensive material. A linen undergarment could help create a layer between skin and outer clothing, and among people who owned enough linen. Changing this inner layer was one way to maintain cleanliness. For the poor, there were fewer choices. A tunic worn during work might also be worn near the fire. A cloak used against rain might serve as a blanket at night. A child could inherit clothing already patched many times. Seams became perfect hiding places for lice. It was common enough that removing lice from another person's hair could be an intimate act of care. Family members might sit together in good light, searching through hair and clothing. The thought may horrify a modern listener, but in a world without insecticide, sealed houses, hot washing machines, or cheap replacement clothes, human fingers were among the most reliable tools available. Even monks were not entirely spared. Monastic rules emphasized cleanliness in different ways, and some religious communities had scheduled bathing or laundry practices. Yet lice appear in medical and moral writings often enough to remind us that sanctity offered little protection from parasites. There were even uncomfortable religious interpretations. Some ascetics accepted vermin as part of bodily hardship. A few extreme holy figures were praised in later stories for enduring filth or insects without complaint, seeing physical discomfort as a lesson in humility. Historians continue to debate how literally such accounts should be read. Medieval writers loved examples of extraordinary devotion, and the habits of a celebrated hermit should not be mistaken for those of every parish priest. Still, the stories reveal something important. People understood that insects lived on bodies. They simply lacked an easy way to prevent it. Rats were larger, more visible, and harder to ignore. A grain chest scratched from within at night could mean lost food by morning. Rats and mice entered barns, kitchens, monasteries, ships, bakeries, and storehouses. Grain was precious. A small animal eating a little each night could quietly consume part of a family's winter security. Cats, therefore, had practical value. They appear in medieval manuscripts prowling beneath tables, climbing near shelves, and occasionally causing exactly the sort of trouble cats have apparently always considered their private duty. Some manuscripts even preserve paw prints from cats that walked across wet ink. It is a small, wonderfully ordinary trace. A scribe sat working by limited light. perhaps beside a beeswax candle if the institution could afford one, or a cheaper tallow light. Parchment rested before him. Ink glistened. Then a cat crossed the page. Centuries later, the marks remain. Not every animal indoors was unwanted. Dogs slept near fires. Chickens might wander close to thresholds. In some houses, especially poorer rural ones, livestock occupied part of the same building as people. Their warmth had value, though so did the risk of smell, flies, dung, and disease. And then there were the beds. Straw mattresses were practical because straw could be replaced. But replacement required suitable material and effort. Old stuffing could become damp. Fleas settled into it. Bedbugs, though less visible in popular images of medieval life, were familiar pests in many later European households and may have troubled earlier sleepers as well. Evidence varies by region, and even now historians continue to debate exactly how widespread different species were in particular centuries. A sleeper did not need a scientific name for the creature biting him. He only needed to wake scratching. Imagine the quiet of the room again. Night has returned. Rain moves gently across a thatched roof, a soft, uneven tapping above the dark rafters. The fire is low. A single candle has been pinched out because wax and tallow are too valuable to waste while everyone sleeps. From somewhere beside the wall comes a tiny rustle. Perhaps it is straw settling, perhaps a mouse. No one rises. A person beneath a wool blanket scratches one ankle and turns over. Outside, mud gathers along the village path. The church tower is barely visible against the cloudy sky. Nothing in the sleeping settlement appears unusual. This is simply a normal night. Cleanliness, after all, was judged differently. Medieval people could strongly dislike foul smells and dirty surroundings. Town ordinances sometimes ordered residents to clear waste. Wealthy households bought fragrant herbs. Monks washed before meals. People complained about filthy neighbours. They were not blind to dirt, but their world continually created it faster than it could be removed. Every journey brought mud indoors. Every fire produced ash and soot. Every animal dropped hair. Every meal left scraps. Every wool garment collected dust. Every human body carried sweat, oil, and sometimes parasites. Soap existed, often made from fats and alkaline substances such as wood ash, but quality varied. It might be used for laundry as much as the body. Fine soap circulated through trade, while ordinary households relied on simpler mixtures, water, cloths, combs, and repeated effort. Even a well-kept house would not smell like a modern room. There would be smoke, wool, leather, old timber, cooking onions, ale, human breath, damp straw, perhaps herbs scattered in the rushes, perhaps a dog sleeping near the hearth, and beneath it all, the slow, earthy smell of a building that was never sealed away from the outside world. To modern senses, it might seem unbearable. To a medieval family, it smelled like home. Morning would come, and someone would sweep the visible dirt toward the door. Fresh rushes might be added. Bedding could be shaken. A comb would pass carefully through tangled hair. A mouse trap might be checked beside the grain chest. Then the household would continue. The bells would sound. The fire would be fed. The pot would return to the hearth, and the unseen inhabitants of floor, cloth, fur, and straw would continue their own quiet lives beneath the footsteps of history. Beyond the cottage door, past the rushes, smoke, and quietly scratching inhabitants of the night. Morning carried people toward the nearest source of water. A village might have a well. Another settlement depended upon a spring emerging beneath stones at the edge of a field. Some households drew water from a stream, In towns, fountains, conduits, rivers, and public wells became gathering places where servants, apprentices, wives, children, travellers, and animals all passed through the same narrow spaces. Water had to be carried. That simple fact shaped daily life. A wooden bucket filled at a well was heavy. A clay vessel could break. A metal container was expensive. Every drop used for washing, cooking, brewing, or cleaning had usually been lifted, transported, and poured by human hands. There was no tap waiting in the corner of the room. A servant in a manor house might make repeated journeys between a courtyard well and a kitchen where cooks shouted for more. In a monastery, carefully arranged channels sometimes brought fresh water closer to cloisters, kitchens, infirmaries, and washing areas. Medieval religious communities could be surprisingly skilled at managing water, especially wealthy houses built near dependable springs. But even good systems required constant care. Leaves blocked channels, mud collected. Animals wandered near sources, buckets touched dirty ground, hands reached into containers. No one can quite agree how often ordinary medieval people consciously connected polluted water with specific illness. They certainly recognized that some water looked, smelled, or tasted foul. They preferred clear springs in many circumstances. Town authorities sometimes attempted to protect wells and watercourses. What they did not possess was a modern understanding of bacteria. A stream could appear perfectly clean while carrying invisible danger. Upstream, a butcher might wash something near the bank. A horse could stand in the shallows. Rain might carry waste from a street. A latrine pit could leak slowly through soil. A corpse, during times of disaster, might create an obvious source of fear, but far smaller forms of contamination passed unnoticed. And so, people drank. The old claim that medieval men and women avoided water entirely and survived on ale is too simple. People certainly drank water. Labourers working in fields needed liquid. Travellers stopped at springs. Monastic records and medical writings mention water frequently. Yet ale was deeply woven into daily life. In many northern European communities, weak ale could be part of an ordinary meal. It provided calories as well as refreshment. Brewing transformed grain and water through boiling and fermentation, processes that could reduce some dangers. Though medieval brewers did not explain the benefit in microbial terms, small ale was often weaker than stronger drink intended for feasts or storage. A household could brew its own. Grain was mashed with warm water. The liquid was separated and fermented. Hops became increasingly important in parts of Europe, though unhopped ale remained common in many periods and regions. Earlier brewers might use mixtures of herbs known as grut. Brewing was skilled work. A failed batch meant wasted grain. An alewife selling poor drink could damage her reputation. In some towns, officials known as ale tasters or ale conners inspected quality, quantity, and prices. The methods varied, and some later stories about inspectors literally sitting in spilled ale to test its stickiness are probably more legend than reliable description. Still, medieval authorities took drink seriously. Bad ale was not merely disappointing. It threatened an essential part of daily supply. In a market square, where carts creaked through mud and bells marked the passing hours, water and drink followed invisible lines of class and occupation. A wealthy household might have servants carrying fresh water from a preferred source. A monastery could control a spring. A castle might possess a deep well inside its walls, particularly important during siege. Poorer residents used what was near. In crowded towns, near could be dangerous. London, Paris, York, Florence, and countless smaller settlements all faced different problems, but the pattern was familiar. Human beings gathered densely, waste accumulated, Industries needed water. Tanneries, dyers, brewers, butchers, and fishmongers depended upon rivers and channels. The same waterway could become useful and filthy within a short distance. Some chroniclers complained bitterly about polluted rivers. Others described clear fountains with pride. Those who recorded the story never fully agreed because medieval water was intensely local. One street suffered. Another neighbourhood had a protected well. One village drank from a hillside spring. Another watched pigs cross its stream. The danger was uneven and therefore difficult to understand. Medical beliefs also shaped drinking habits. Medieval physicians inherited ideas from ancient Greek and Roman medicine, especially theories concerning the four humours. Health depended, they believed, upon balance between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, food, weather, age, season, and drink could alter that balance. Water itself might be judged according to its qualities. Was it cold, warm, still running? From a river, from rain from a marsh? Some medical writers advised examining the source, smell, clarity, and surrounding land. Water passing through certain soils was considered better than water standing in stagnant places. One remedy for suspicious water was boiling, another was straining. Wine might be mixed with water, herbs or spices could be added. These practices were not consistent, and their effectiveness varied, but they reveal that medieval people were not simply careless. They were observing a world without knowing its hidden mechanisms. A person could drink from a clear well and become sick. Another could swallow from a questionable stream and remain healthy. Without germ theory, the pattern seemed mysterious. Perhaps the air was corrupt. Perhaps the body's humours had shifted. Perhaps a planet exerted an unfavourable influence. Perhaps God had permitted illness. Perhaps a saint had been neglected. Some people wore protective charms. Others carried herbs. A traveller might pray at a roadside shrine before continuing toward an unfamiliar town, where the water tasted different and the local ale was brewed by hands he did not know. Pilgrims experienced this uncertainty constantly. They walked muddy roads between abbeys, bridges, shrines, inns, and villages. A pilgrim badge fastened to a cloak announced devotion and perhaps offered a feeling of spiritual protection. At day's end, the traveller searched for food, shelter, and something to drink. A monastery guest house could offer water or ale. An innkeeper poured from a jug. A spring beside the road invited anyone passing. There was rarely a reliable way to know what waited invisibly inside the cup. Now evening settles over the road. Mist gathers in the low fields, pale beneath a rising moon. A horse drinks slowly at the edge of a stream while a traveller kneels farther upstream. Somewhere beyond the trees, monastery bells begin to sound. The traveller fills a small vessel. Cold water touches his fingers. He pauses. Perhaps he looks at the current. Perhaps he remembers a warning heard at the last village. Some chroniclers claim that travellers learned to judge water by its movement, smell, or the animals living nearby. Whether every ordinary person followed such rules is impossible to know. The traveller drinks. Then he continues. There was another problem with water. People needed it for washing, but washing required more carrying. Hands might be rinsed before eating, particularly in households observing formal customs. At noble tables, servants could pour water over guests' hands into basins. Monastic communities maintained lavatories where monks washed at appointed times, but a full-body bath demanded much more. Buckets had to be drawn, fuel had to heat the water, a tub had to be prepared. For an ordinary labouring family, this was not a small task at the end of a long day. People therefore washed selectively. Faces, hands, feet, visible dirt. Cloths dampened with water could clean the body. Bathing practices differed greatly, and the idea that every medieval person avoided washing is plainly misleading. Yet water remained work. Even cleaning a chamber pot required water. So did washing cooking vessels. So did laundry. So did brewing. So did caring for the sick. The same household supply was pulled in many directions. In winter, a well could freeze around its edges. Paths became slippery. Buckets felt bitterly cold against fingers. Carrying water before sunrise was an unpleasant necessity completed while the rest of the village still seemed asleep. In summer, demand increased. Animals drank more. Workers sweated in fields. Shallow sources could shrink. Stagnant pools warmed beneath the sun. Flies gathered. And when sickness spread through a household, people often continued drawing water from the same place because there was simply nowhere else to go. This, perhaps, is one of the most disturbing ordinary realities of medieval life. Danger did not always arrive with the sword. It did not always ride beneath a banner or appear as plague bells sounding over a terrified town. Sometimes danger looked like a wooden bucket, clear water, a cup passed between family members, a child drinking after work, a monk rinsing his hands, a traveller pausing beside a quiet stream. The water gave life. The water cooked the pottage, it brewed the ale, it washed the linen, it fed gardens, it turned mill wheels farther downstream, and sometimes, without changing colour or scent, it carried illness into the very households that depended upon it. The bells fade across the fields, mist thickens beside the river. A bucket rests near an oak door filled for mourning. No one fears it. No one has reason to. And in the darkness, beneath the surface reflecting the moon, an invisible world moves quietly with the current. Illness rarely announced itself politely. A tooth began to throb while bread was being chewed. A finger cut on an iron tool swelled overnight. A farmer rose from his straw mattress with pain in one knee and found that the walk to the fields felt strangely longer than it had the day before. In the medieval world, discomfort was familiar. People lived close to smoke, cold, dampness, sharp tools, animals, rough roads, and hard physical labour. Bodies were strained from carrying water, lifting grain sacks, bending over fields, hauling timber, kneeling in prayer, and sleeping on surfaces that offered little forgiveness to aching joints. Pain was not unusual. Relief was uncertain. A toothache could be particularly cruel. Medieval diets varied by wealth and region, but bread formed an important part of life in many communities. Grain was ground in mills where tiny fragments of stone might enter the flour. Over years, such particles could wear down teeth. Honey, dried fruits, and other sweet foods also contributed to decay among those able to obtain them. Dental suffering appears often enough in surviving remains to show that many people endured serious problems. A cracked tooth could become infected. A cavity deepened. Gums swelled. Sleep became difficult. No one can quite agree how an ordinary villager decided when pain had become unbearable enough to seek help. Professional medical care was expensive and often distant. A university-trained physician was unlikely to appear beside every cottage fire. Instead, assistance came from whoever possessed knowledge, confidence, or a useful pair of hands. A barber might cut hair, trim beards, dress wounds, and perform minor surgical tasks. A local healer knew herbs. A monastery infirmarian maintained remedies copied from older texts. A woman in the village might have learned treatments from her mother, and if a tooth truly had to come out, someone had to pull it. The tools were not delicate. Tooth-drawing instruments existed in different forms, some resembling forceps or gripping devices designed to seize the tooth. The patient sat or was held steady. There was no modern local anaesthetic. Alcohol might dull fear. Herbs could be used. Opium was known in medieval medicine, though access and preparation varied greatly. Mandrake carried a reputation for inducing sleep or numbness, and gathered layers of folklore around its supposed powers. One famous belief claimed that the mandrake root screamed when pulled from the earth, and that hearing the cry could kill a person. Those who recorded the story never fully agreed on how seriously such tales were believed. Some described elaborate methods involving tying a dog to the plant so that the animal, rather than a human, pulled the root free. The story feels distant and strange. The toothache did not. When extraction began, the objective was simple: remove the source of suffering. Sometimes the tooth came free, sometimes it broke, sometimes bleeding continued. Sometimes infection had already spread beyond the limits of anything a medieval healer could control. A cloth might be pressed against the wound. Wine could be used in cleaning. Herbal mixtures were applied. Cloves later became known for easing dental pain because of their natural numbing qualities, though their availability depended upon trade and wealth. Other remedies included sage, salt, vinegar, and countless plant preparations whose value ranged from genuinely useful to entirely symbolic. A toothache might even be blamed upon a toothworm. The belief was ancient and survived in various parts of Europe. People imagined a small creature gnawing inside the tooth and causing pain. Remedies sometimes attempted to smoke the worm out. Henbane seeds, for example, could be heated so their fumes reached the mouth. Certain descriptions claim that afterward, small worm-like objects could appear in water or on a surface, apparently proving the treatment had worked. Modern explanations suggest plant material or debris may have created the illusion. Still, to a person whose pain suddenly eased, the explanation hardly mattered. A medieval cure was judged by experience. Did the swelling shrink? Did the fever break? Could the patient sleep? Could the labourer return to work? Medicine lived somewhere between observation, inherited theory, religion, and hope. Bloodletting occupied a particularly important place in this world. According to humoral medicine, the body's four humours needed balance. Too much blood, phlegm, yellow bile, or black bile could create illness depending upon the patient's temperament and circumstances. Removing blood might restore order. Physicians consulted charts. The season mattered. The patient's age mattered. Astrology could matter. Some practitioners believed certain parts of the body should not be bled when the moon or planets occupied particular positions. Monastic calendars sometimes contained information related to favourable and unfavourable days for bleeding. The procedure might involve opening a vein with a small blade known as a phleem or lancet. Blood flowed into a bowl. How much was removed depended upon the practitioner and the condition being treated. A monk could be bled several times a year as part of regulated health practice in some religious communities. Afterward, he might receive rest and better food. This detail is easy to miss. Bloodletting was not always viewed as an emergency measure. It could be routine. A person who appeared perfectly healthy might willingly sit while a vein was opened, because medicine taught that removing excess blood could prevent future trouble. Historians continue to debate how consistently these rules were followed outside formal institutions. Rural healing was rarely as orderly as medical manuscripts suggested, yet the image remains unsettling. A quiet room, a basin, a sharpened blade. A patient watching dark blood collect because everyone present believed the body was being returned to balance. When wounds were severe, treatment could become harsher. Cautery was one option. A heated metal instrument might be pressed against tissue to stop bleeding or treat certain conditions. The logic was old and widely respected. Fire could close what had opened. The smell and pain are difficult to imagine calmly, but medieval surgical texts discuss cautery with the same practical attention given to other procedures. Surgeons also cleaned wounds, removed arrows, set bones, and stitched injuries. Their results varied. Some possessed impressive skill learned through experience. Others made fatal mistakes. A knight injured in battle and a carpenter cut by an axe could both face the same terrifying truth. The body might survive the initial wound and still be lost to infection days later. Remedies attempted to prevent this. Honey was used on some wounds. Modern science has confirmed that certain kinds of honey can inhibit bacterial growth, though medieval healers understood the effect through experience rather than microbiology. Wine was used to wash injuries. Herbs such as yarrow gained reputations for treating bleeding. Spiderwebs were sometimes placed over wounds, possibly because their fine texture helped form a covering, though their cleanliness would depend entirely upon where they were collected. Some healers prepared salves from animal fats, plants, resins, and minerals. A recipe might contain dozens of ingredients. Others included words of prayer. A charm could be spoken over a patient. The names of saints might be written on parchment and carried against the body. Relics were visited. Holy wells attracted the sick. The boundary between medicine and faith was not sharp. A person could take an herbal drink in the morning and pray before a saint's bone in the afternoon, without sensing any contradiction. Both were methods of seeking help. And then, as evening returned, the sick room became quieter. Wind moved against the shutters. A beeswax candle burned near the bed in a wealthy house, while poorer rooms depended on tallow or the fading hearth. Somewhere in the distance, bells marked the hour for a monastery community. A woman lay beneath a wool blanket with fever. Near her bed stood a cup containing an herbal infusion. The room smelled of smoke and damp cloth. A healer had already examined her urine, another common diagnostic practice. Medieval practitioners studied its colour, clarity, sediment, and smell. Special flasks known as maculae were used by physicians, and illustrations often show doctors holding urine vessels up toward the light. The practice became so closely associated with medicine that the urine flask itself was almost a symbol of the physician. Some diagnoses were sensible observations. Others followed complex theories that could not possibly reveal what was truly happening inside the body. But the healer watched. He asked questions. He examined. He tried. That is worth remembering. Medieval medicine was not simply a collection of absurd cruelties. People learned that certain plants reduced pain. They recognized signs of fever. They knew how to set many fractures. They used bandages. They understood that rest could matter. Monastic infirmaries offered structured care. Midwives possessed generations of practical knowledge. Yet their useful discoveries existed beside harmful beliefs. A patient weakened by illness could be bled. A wound could be cauterized unnecessarily. A poisoned substance might be prescribed in the wrong dose. Mercury was used for certain conditions. Arsenic appeared in medical preparations. One person's cure could become another person's final suffering. For modern listeners, perhaps the most horrifying part is not the blade or the iron, it is the uncertainty. There was no blood test, no X-ray, no knowledge of antibiotics. A healer could sound completely confident and still be entirely wrong. The patient often had no better option. So he opened his mouth for the tooth puller. He extended his arm for the lancet. He swallowed the bitter mixture. He allowed the hot iron near the wound. Then he returned to bed beneath a rough blanket and waited. Outside, frost settled quietly across the winter fields. Smoke drifted from cottage roofs. The village grew still, and in dark rooms behind oak doors, medieval people listened to their own breathing, wondering whether the remedy was beginning to work, or whether the pain was simply gathering strength for another night. Food waited at the centre of nearly every medieval day. It waited in blackened cooking pots, in baskets carried to market, in wooden bowls on trestle tables, and in sacks of grain stored carefully against the winter. The entire rhythm of village life depended upon planting, harvesting, grinding, salting, drying, smoking, and preserving enough to survive the months when fields offered little. Hunger was understood. Waste was feared. And because food was precious, medieval people often accepted risks that modern diners would find difficult to ignore. Bread came first for many families. A dark loaf made from rye, barley, oats, or mixed grains might form a large part of the ordinary diet. Wheat bread, pale and fine, was associated with wealth in many places. Poorer households ate coarser bread, sometimes containing husks, grit, or seeds that had escaped careful cleaning. The millstone itself could leave traces in flour. Tiny fragments of stone entered the grain and, over years, helped wear down teeth already vulnerable to infection. But the greater danger sometimes lay in the harvest. Wet grain spoiled. Mould grew. Rye could be infected by ergot, a fungus capable of producing severe poisoning. Victims might suffer convulsions, burning pain, hallucinations, or damage to the limbs. Medieval communities knew that strange outbreaks occurred, though they did not understand the fungus in modern terms. Some chroniclers described terrible illnesses in which people felt as though they were burning from within. Religious interpretations followed. Saints were invoked. Hospitals associated with St. Anthony became famous for caring for sufferers of what was later called St. Anthony's fire. No one can quite agree how frequently ergot poisoning explains particular medieval accounts, because symptoms could be confused with other diseases. Still, the danger was real. A loaf could look ordinary. The grain had grown in a familiar field. The baker had done nothing unusual, and yet the bread itself might carry something capable of filling a village with agony. Most meals were far less dramatic. A pot of pottage simmered over the fire. Peas, beans, onions, cabbage, leeks, oats, herbs. Whatever was available could be added. The pot might remain in use for long periods, with fresh ingredients joining what remained from an earlier meal. This did not mean that every medieval household maintained an eternal stew for years, as some modern stories suggest. Such claims are often exaggerated, but continuous cooking and repeated reheating were practical. Fuel cost effort. A family that had already built a fire used its heat carefully. Meat, when available, presented another challenge. Fresh meat spoiled quickly. There was no mechanical refrigeration. Winter cold could preserve food temporarily, but summer warmth transformed kitchens and market stalls into much more uncertain places. Salting was essential, so was smoking. Pork could be cured, fish were dried or smoked. Herring crossed long distances packed in salt. Bacon hung from rafters. Sausages used parts of an animal that might otherwise be wasted. A slaughtered animal represented months or years of feeding and care. Very little was casually discarded. Organs were eaten. Blood entered recipes. Feet, heads, intestines, and bones all had uses. A modern visitor watching a medieval butcher at work might feel faint long before lunch. The butcher was simply doing his trade. In town, slaughter could happen close to where people lived. Blood ran into drains or streets. Offal collected. Dogs waited. Flies arrived. Authorities sometimes tried to control where animals could be killed or where waste could be thrown, but rules were only useful when enforced. Some chroniclers complained about meat sold after it had begun to spoil. Market laws reveal the same concern. If authorities repeatedly prohibited rotten fish or diseased meat, it suggests that someone kept trying to sell it. Spices are sometimes said to have been used to disguise rotten meat. the truth is more complicated. Imported spices such as pepper, cinnamon, cloves, mace, and ginger were expensive. Wealthy households bought them partly for taste, status, and medical beliefs, using costly pepper to rescue cheap. Obviously, putrid meat would often make little financial sense, yet strong sauces, vinegar, herbs, and seasoning could certainly change the taste of food that was no longer perfectly fresh. And medieval definitions of acceptable freshness were not always ours. A bird or piece of game might be hung before cooking, cheese ripened, meat was cured, fish were heavily salted. Strong smells did not automatically mean food was rejected. The human nose learned the food culture around it. At a market stall, buyers examined produce with their own senses. They looked, they touched, they smelled. There were no printed expiration dates, no sealed plastic, no temperature-controlled delivery van arriving before dawn. Trust mattered. Reputation mattered. The regulations of the town mattered. A dishonest baker might be accused of selling underweight bread. A brewer might weaken ale. Flour could be mixed with inferior material. Saffron, because of its value, attracted adulteration. Spices could be stretched with cheaper substitutes. Medieval authorities developed punishments for fraudulent traders, sometimes involving public shame. The exact practices varied greatly between towns, and historians continue to debate how effective market inspection truly was. But the anxiety is clear. People knew food could be cheated. Inside a wealthy hall, dinner looked more impressive. Servants carried dishes beneath soot-dark beams. Candles flickered. A lord, his household, guests, clerics, and retainers sat according to rank. Food might be placed upon trenchers. A trencher could be a flat piece of stale bread used almost like a plate. It absorbed grease and sauce during the meal. Afterward, these bread trenchers might be eaten, given to servants, distributed to the poor, or passed to animals, depending upon custom and household. Knives were common at the table. Spoons appeared. Forks were far less widespread in much of medieval Europe, and could attract suspicion as strange luxury objects in some periods. People ate with fingers. This was not considered filthy when proper etiquette was observed. Hands were washed before meals in many formal households. Servants poured water over them. Towels were provided. Dining manuals advised people not to place dirty fingers into shared dishes and not to return bitten food to communal plates. The existence of such advice suggests that manners were necessary because temptation was familiar. Shared food was ordinary. Several diners might reach toward the same dish. A cup could be passed. A bowl could serve more than one person. Salt sat in a communal container. Bread moved from hand to hand. If someone at the table was ill, the meal offered countless opportunities for invisible transmission. No one understood this. They understood courtesy instead. Do not spit across the table. Do not blow the nose into the tablecloth. Do not scratch excessively while dining. Do not dip food repeatedly into the common sauce. Medieval etiquette could sound surprisingly modern until one remembers why someone had bothered to write the rules down. In a poorer cottage, ceremony was simpler. The family gathered around the hearth. Perhaps there was pottage and coarse bread. Perhaps a little smoked fish, ale, an onion, a piece of cheese hard enough to travel. The wooden spoon might be worn smooth from years of use. The bowl could be shared. Before eating, a prayer was said. Then hunger made people practical. Food that fell onto clean rushes might be picked up. Mould could be cut from cheese or bread if the remaining portion seemed usable. A piece of meat with a suspicious edge might be trimmed. No one wanted to throw away tomorrow's meal. One lesser-known danger came from food storage itself. Grain attracted rodents. Insects entered flour. Weevils appeared in stored cereals. A sack that looked secure could contain movement when opened. People sifted grain. They picked through food. They removed what they could see. Everything else entered the pot or oven. Perhaps that thought is best left to drift quietly for a moment. Outside, rain begins to fall on the roofs of the town. Water runs between uneven stones and darkens the timber walls. Market stalls have closed. Fishmongers have packed away their remaining goods. Somewhere in a narrow lane, a baker's oven still gives off warmth. Inside the houses, evening meals are ending. A spoon scrapes the bottom of a bowl. Someone breaks the last piece of bread. The monastery bell sounds through the rain. For most medieval people, food was not entertainment. It was security measured in sacks, barrels, smoked sides of pork, strings of onions, and loaves. A failed harvest could change everything. A wet summer could raise prices. War could interrupt roads. A lord's demands could reduce what remained for a peasant household. Under such conditions, people became skilled at eating what existed. Old bread became trenchers or entered other dishes. Bones flavoured broth. Fat was saved. Leftovers returned to the pot. Stale ale might still have uses. The horrifying question was rarely whether food met a perfect standard. The question was whether there was enough, and so a family might sit beneath blackened rafters, eating from a shared bowl with hands that had worked all day, while flies rested somewhere near the hearth and a mouse waited behind the grain chest. The bread was gritty. The fish was heavily salted. The ale tasted slightly sour. No one pushed the meal away. Beyond the oak door, rain continued falling over muddy roads and empty fields. Tomorrow would require strength. The bowl was passed again, and every last useful scrap was eaten. The scraps that remained after a meal rarely belonged to humans alone. Near the hearth, a dog waited. Its patience could be admirable when food was plentiful, and considerably less admirable when a bone rolled beneath the table. In cottages, kitchens, manor halls, and monastery yards, animals moved through medieval life with a closeness that would make many modern households deeply uncomfortable. They were not visitors. They belonged to the working world. A dog guarded the door, followed a shepherd, hunted beside a nobleman, slept beneath a bench, and sometimes cleaned the floor in the simplest possible fashion. Cats watched grain stores and kitchens for mice. Chickens wandered through yards. Geese hissed at strangers. Pigs searched for anything edible. In many places, animals were simply part of the landscape of daily existence. The boundary between human space and animal space was not always firm. A rural house could include livestock beneath the same roof as the family. The arrangement varied by region and century, and no one can quite agree how common particular house plans were across medieval Europe. In some areas, people and animals occupied separate sections of a long building. Elsewhere, a stable stood directly beside the living space. The logic was practical. Animals were valuable. A cow represented milk, calves, manure, and potential meat. An ox provided strength for ploughing. Sheep gave wool. Pigs transformed scraps, roots, and forest forage into flesh and fat. Leaving such wealth entirely unprotected outside made little sense. Winter made the arrangement even more understandable. Cold wind moved across fields. Snow gathered against walls. A cow inside a building gave off warmth. So did several sheep. Their breathing, movement, and bodies changed the temperature of the enclosed space. The warmth came with a price. Smell, flies, noise, dung, urine, damp straw. A modern visitor might step through the doorway, breathe once, and immediately reconsider the entire journey into the past. The household did not have that luxury. Dung was useful. It fertilized fields. Stable waste could be collected and moved to manure heaps. Straw mixed with animal waste became part of the agricultural cycle, returning nutrients to the soil. What smelled offensive in one corner of a yard became valuable when spread across farmland. Medieval people understood this relationship through long experience. They watched fields. They knew poor soil. They knew that land repeatedly cultivated without care became less productive. Manure was not merely filth, it was future grain. Still, between stable and field, there was a great deal of it. In villages, animals crossed roads and paths constantly. Hooves churned mud. Carts passed through dung. Shoes carried the mixture indoors. Pigs were particularly determined inhabitants of medieval settlements. They ate almost anything. Kitchen scraps disappeared into their mouths. They rooted through refuse, in wooded regions. Pigs were driven into forests during autumn to feed upon acorns and beech mast. This practice, often called pannage, could be regulated by lords who controlled woodland rights. A swineherd watched the animals beneath ancient trees. The pigs wandered between fallen leaves, searching the ground. Bells might be fastened to some livestock. The forest filled with small sounds, branches, hooves, occasional grunting, far away. Perhaps the bells of an abbey reached the woodland edge. It was a peaceful scene, until the pigs entered town. Urban authorities repeatedly issued rules concerning wandering animals. The details differed from place to place, but medieval records reveal frustration with pigs loose in streets, damaging property or creating danger. Some pigs became famous for the worst possible reason. Animals could be involved in legal proceedings. Medieval and early modern records include trials of pigs and other creatures accused of harming or killing humans. These cases remain among the strangest features of historical law. A pig that killed a child might be formally prosecuted. Witnesses could be heard. The animal might be sentenced and executed. Some historians argue that these proceedings reinforced community order and demonstrated the authority of law. Others caution that surviving cases were unusual precisely because they were recorded. Even now, historians continue to debate how ordinary people understood such trials. Did villagers truly believe an animal possessed moral responsibility? Was the trial primarily symbolic? Was it a legal method of managing dangerous property? The records rarely reveal the private thoughts of the people standing in the crowd. What they do reveal is a world where animals were so deeply woven into human society that, on rare occasions, they could even be drawn into human systems of justice. Most days were less remarkable. A chicken entered a doorway. A goat chewed something it should not. A dog barked during conversation. An ox relieved itself in the road. Life continued. In great halls, dogs could be almost constant companions. Hunting dogs were prized and carefully trained. Nobles maintained specialized animals for different forms of hunting. Greyhounds, mastiff-like dogs, scent hounds, and other types appear in manuscripts and records. A fine hunting dog could be valuable. It might receive better care than many ordinary labourers could afford for themselves. Dogs also appeared beneath dining tables. Medieval etiquette texts occasionally warned diners against feeding them too openly or allowing animals to become troublesome during meals. Again, the existence of a rule suggests a familiar problem. A guest wanted to slip something beneath the table. The dog knew this. The dog had perhaps built an entire career around knowing it. That is as close as our journey needs to come to a smile tonight. Cats occupied a more uncertain cultural position. They were useful hunters of rodents, particularly around grain. Monasteries, homes, and shops benefited from their presence. Manuscripts show cats in wonderfully ordinary scenes. A cat sits near a fire, a cat watches a mouse, a cat climbs, a cat interferes with a person's work. Yet cats could also become connected with superstition. Their night movements, shining eyes, and independence encourage stories. Certain colours, especially black, later attracted darker associations, though medieval attitudes were not uniform. Some people connected cats with witchcraft or evil. Others simply needed them to keep mice away from flour. A medieval animal could be practical and mysterious at the same time. The same was true of birds. Owls carried omens in some traditions. Ravens and crows gathered around battlefields and gallows, becoming symbols of death. Swallows nesting around houses could be viewed favourably. Roosters marked the morning and carried religious symbolism because of the biblical story of Peter's denial of Christ. Animals filled sermons, legends, calendars, carvings, and dreams. A person watching a hare cross the road might remember an old belief. A traveller hearing an owl after sunset could feel uneasy. A farmer knew that weather, birth, illness, and animal behaviour all seemed connected by patterns that were difficult to explain. Some chroniclers claim that unusual animal behaviour foretold disaster. Dogs howled before deaths. Birds appeared before battles. Livestock refused food before storms. Whether such signs were recognised before the event or remembered afterward is impossible to know. The medieval world had room for both explanations. An animal could be hungry. An animal could also be an omen. Meanwhile, the physical closeness created more immediate problems. Fleas moved between hosts. Ticks attached themselves. Animal parasites entered buildings. Milk could carry disease. Meat from unhealthy livestock could be eaten. People were bitten. Children played in yards where animal waste lay on the ground. Hands that touched a sick animal later prepared food. There was no clear theory of zoonotic disease. If several members of a household became ill after caring for livestock, the cause could be blamed on bad air, poor humoral balance, weather, or divine judgment. The animal itself might not appear dangerous. After all, people had lived beside animals their entire lives. That familiarity created acceptance. A cow coughed. A pig had sores. A sheep weakened. The household observed. Perhaps a folk remedy was tried. Salt, herbs, a spoken charm. A saint associated with animals might be invoked. St. Anthony, for example, became closely associated with pigs in later medieval imagery, partly through the practices of religious communities connected with his cult. Protective blessings for livestock also existed. Animals mattered too much to leave entirely to chance. A sick ox could delay ploughing. A dead cow could ruin a household. A lost flock meant lost wool and food. So the farmer watched carefully. He knew the rhythm of an animal's breathing. He noticed when it stood differently. He recognized changes in dung, appetite, or movement. This was practical knowledge built through long years, yet the cures remained uncertain. Now dusk settles over a manor yard. The last winter light fades behind bare trees. A stable door stands partly open, and warm breath rises from horses inside. Somewhere nearby, a woman shakes straw from her skirt after feeding chickens. A pig shifts heavily in its enclosure. A dog circles twice beside the hearth before lying down. Beyond the walls, frost begins to form on the road. The village grows quieter. People and animals settle almost together. In one building, cattle stand behind a wooden partition while a family prepares for sleep on the other side. The air is thick with smoke, wool, straw, and the deep warm smell of livestock. No one finds the arrangement extraordinary. The animals provide labour, food, warmth, protection, companionship, and risk. Their bodies carry insects, their hooves spread filth, their waste runs into yards, their illnesses sometimes cross silently into human life. Yet morning will come, and the stable door will open again. The cow will be milked, the horse will be harnessed, the pigs will search for scraps, the dog will follow whoever leaves first. Along the muddy road, human footprints and hoofprints will overlap until it becomes difficult to say where one world ends and the other begins. For medieval people, perhaps it never did. The road beyond the stable did not become cleaner when it entered town. In fact, it often became worse. A medieval town gathered people, animals, workshops, kitchens, markets, wells, stables, breweries, bakeries, and slaughterhouses into spaces enclosed by walls or squeezed along narrow streets. The concentration created opportunity. Goods could be sold. News arrived quickly. Craftsmen found customers. Bells summoned people to churches, courts, and markets. It also created waste. Every household produced ashes. Every kitchen produced scraps. Every animal produced dung. Every chamber pot had to be emptied. Every workshop created something it no longer wanted. The modern city hides most of these materials beneath streets, behind walls, inside pipes, or within systems of regular collection. A medieval town displayed them. The first thing a traveller noticed may have been the smell. It changed from lane to lane. Near a bakery, warm bread and smoke drifted from an oven. Near a brewery, there was wet grain and fermentation. Close to a fish market, the air became sharper. A tannery could produce an odour strong enough to make even people accustomed to town life complain. Leather required treatment. Animal hides arrived carrying hair, flesh, blood, and fat. They had to be cleaned and prepared. Some processes used lime. Others involved substances rich in ammonia. Urine could be collected for industrial purposes. Dog dung was used in certain stages of leather preparation because enzymes helped soften hides. To modern ears, the entire procedure sounds like a punishment. To a tanner, it was skilled work. The leather produced became shoes, belts, harnesses, bags, scabbards, book coverings, and countless other useful objects. People wanted the finished product. They simply preferred, when possible, for the worst-smelling work to happen somewhere else. Town authorities sometimes attempted to move noxious trades toward rivers or beyond dense residential areas. But space was limited, custom was powerful, and enforcement varied. No one can quite agree how consistently medieval sanitation laws were obeyed. Surviving ordinances often sound impressively strict. Residents were ordered not to throw certain waste into streets. Butchers were told where to discard remains. Ditches had to be cleared. Public passages were not to be blocked. The repeated appearance of the same command suggests that obedience was imperfect. A rule against dumping refuse existed because someone was dumping refuse, and someone probably continued after the rule was written. From upper windows, household waste could be emptied into lanes. Popular stories often imagine everyone cheerfully throwing chamber pot contents onto strangers below while shouting warnings. The reality was more complicated. Towns developed customs and restrictions, and people were capable of becoming very angry when neighbours fouled shared spaces. Still, waste entered streets. Human waste could be stored in cesspits or privies and later removed by labourers. In parts of England, those who cleaned such pits became known as gong farmers in later medieval and early modern contexts. They worked at night in some places. The job was dangerous and unpleasant. A pit had to be opened. The contents were shoveled or lifted out. Waste was loaded into carts and moved beyond populated areas, sometimes for use as fertilizer. The smell clung to clothing. There were risks of suffocation in enclosed pits, collapse, and disease, yet the work had to be done. A full privy did not negotiate. In castles, guardrobe shafts created their own problems. Waste collected below walls or in pits. During siege or neglect, the result could become formidable. Some castle garderobes emptied into moats. This has given the medieval moat an unfortunate reputation. Not every moat was a permanent river of sewage. Many held flowing water or were dry defensive ditches, yet waste could certainly enter them, along with animal remains and general refuse. Water, once again, carried unwanted material away. Away was a useful medieval idea. If waste moved beyond the doorway, beyond the stall, or farther downstream, the immediate problem appeared smaller. Unfortunately, someone else often lived farther downstream. Workshops depended upon rivers for this reason. Dyers used large quantities of water. Cloth processing created waste. Butchers washed blood away. Tanners needed water. Brewers and bakers also depended upon reliable supplies, though they had obvious reasons to prefer cleaner sources. The river passed through all of these competing needs. Upstream and downstream mattered. Town authorities sometimes protected particular conduits or wells from industrial pollution. Fines were imposed. But in crowded settlements, perfect separation was impossible. Rain made everything move. A hard shower fell against roofs and timber walls, gathering soot and dirt. Water rushed along gutters or the centre of narrow streets. Dung softened. Ash became grey paste. Blood from a butcher's area thinned into red water. Vegetable scraps drifted against stones. Boots entered the mixture. Cartwheels cut through it. A long wool cloak brushed too near the ground. Then someone carried the mud indoors, in dry weather. Different trouble appeared. Waste dried. Dust rose. Flies multiplied around discarded food and animal remains. The market square could begin the morning relatively orderly and end beneath a layer of crushed leaves, feathers, straw, mud, fish scales, and whatever had fallen from carts. Market tolls and regulations helped control commerce, but cleaning was still physical work. Someone swept. Someone shoveled. Someone pushed the remains aside. There were no hidden machines arriving before dawn. The street depended upon human labour and public discipline. Some towns employed officials or contracted workers to remove refuse. Others placed much of the duty on householders. A person could be responsible for cleaning the area before his own property. The result was uneven. One frontage looked tolerable. The next was neglected. A drainage channel blocked with straw could create a filthy pool after rain. Pigs made use of the situation. Dogs investigated. Children moved through it all. This is perhaps what would most horrify a modern visitor. Not simply the existence of dirt. It was the casual closeness. A child sat near a doorway while a cart rolled past through dung. A woman bought onions a short distance from a butcher's waste. An apprentice carried bread through a lane where wastewater had just been poured. A pilgrim rested beside a public fountain after walking roads coated in mud and animal droppings. Everyone understood that some places smelled worse than others, but invisible contamination remained invisible. One lesser-known urban habit involved the careful location of wells and privies, at least where people had the space and knowledge to consider it. Property disputes sometimes mentioned drainage, waste pits, and water access, because neighbours recognised that badly managed waste created obvious problems. They could see seepage, they could smell corruption, they could complain when a privy stood too close. They simply lacked modern scientific explanations for every disease that followed. When illness spread, bad smells were often treated as dangerous in themselves. The belief in poisonous or corrupted air would later become strongly associated with miasma theory. but the broader connection between foul odour and sickness had deep roots. This encouraged people to burn fragrant materials. Herbs might be scattered. Vinegar was valued. During epidemics, aromatic substances gained special importance. A sweet smell suggested purity. A foul smell suggested danger. The reasoning was incomplete, yet in streets filled with rotting waste, avoiding the worst odours may sometimes have accidentally led people away from genuine sources of infection. Sometimes, not always. The town bells sound now through a wet afternoon. Rain falls steadily. Under projecting upper stories, townspeople move close to walls, lifting hems and choosing their steps. A cart passes slowly. Its wooden wheels complain against the stones. Water runs in a shallow channel along the lane. A woman opens a door and empties a basin. Farther down, a dog drinks briefly before being called away. The water continues, past the inn, past the baker, past a shrine fixed into a wall where a small candle burns behind a screen. Then beneath a bridge and toward the river. At night, streets grew more dangerous in simpler ways. Without regular lighting, people carried lanterns or relied upon moonlight. A dark lane concealed holes, refuse piles, and open drains. Someone who had consumed too much ale could easily stumble. In some places, residents were expected to hang lights outside during particular occasions or periods. But medieval towns remained profoundly dark by modern standards. A person walking home listened carefully. Footsteps, a horse, water dripping from a roof, the distant scrape of a door, a rat moving beside a wall, and beneath each step lay whatever the day had left behind. By dawn, sweepers and householders began again. Shutters opened, smoke rose. Market sellers returned. Fresh vegetables appeared on boards above yesterday's dirt. Bread arrived in baskets. Butchers sharpened knives. Animals were driven through gates. The town awakened over the remains of its own previous day. To us, this can seem almost impossible. How could people accept it? The answer may be that acceptance was not complete. They complained. They fined neighbours. They wrote regulations, they moved trades, they dug pits, they cleared drains, they hired people for the worst tasks. But medieval sanitation was a constant contest against the material life of thousands of human beings and animals crowded together without modern infrastructure. The town never won for long. By evening, the streets were dirty again. And as firelight began appearing behind narrow windows, waste settled into the mud, water moved slowly through open channels, and the bells marked another hour above a city that smelled, leaked, drained, dumped, swept, and endured. Above those crowded streets stood the places where order was made visible: a market cross, a town hall, a manor court, the gateway of a castle, a church porch where notices were proclaimed and disputes sometimes gathered before they reached a judge. Medieval society depended heavily upon reputation, rank, oath, custom, and public knowledge. Many people lived their entire lives among neighbours who knew their families, their work, their debts, and their quarrels. A private mistake could become communal news before the evening bell. Punishment, therefore, was often designed to be seen. For a modern person, this may be among the most uncomfortable habits of the medieval world. Justice did not always disappear behind stone walls. Sometimes it was placed in the market square. The stocks were simple. A wooden frame restrained the feet, and sometimes the hands, of an offender. A person could be left sitting or lying in an exposed place where everyone passing had the opportunity to look. The pillory usually held the head and hands upright. The distinction varied over time and place. and the words were not always used consistently in surviving records. Even now, historians continue to debate the exact form of some early devices described in legal texts. But the purpose was unmistakable. The punished person became visible, a dishonest trader, a quarrelsome offender, someone convicted of a local nuisance, a person who had broken regulations concerning bread, ale, or market behaviour. The crimes associated with stocks and pillories differed widely between towns, but shame was central. Imagine an ordinary market morning. Carts arrive before sunrise, vegetables are arranged, fish are lifted from barrels, a baker sets out loaves. The smell of smoke, wet wool, onions, and horses gathers beneath the cold air. Near the centre of the square, one person cannot leave. People pass, some stare, some speak, some do not. Children notice immediately. Neighbours already know the story, or believe they do. The punishment works through the crowd. This was a society where being known mattered enormously. Credit depended upon reputation. Marriage prospects depended partly upon reputation, employment, guild membership, and trust within a village could all be damaged by public disgrace. A few hours in the stocks might end. The memory could remain. Crowds sometimes added their own cruelty. Rotten food might be thrown. Mud. Dung. The exact extent of such behaviour is difficult to establish, because later literature often emphasised the disorder of public punishments. Some chroniclers claimed crowds were merciless, while other records suggest officials tried to regulate proceedings. Those who recorded the story never fully agreed. Perhaps every town had its own temperament. A small village where everyone knew the offender might react differently from a large city crowd watching a stranger. The important thing is that humiliation was not an accidental side effect. It was part of the sentence. Other punishments marked the body. Whipping occurred in various legal systems. Ears could be cut, noses could be mutilated. Branding, though more strongly associated with some later periods and jurisdictions, reflected the broader principle that punishment could leave a permanent sign. A body became a record. This horrifies modern sensibilities because many societies now place great emphasis on rehabilitation, privacy, and the possibility that a completed sentence should eventually become past. Medieval justice could make forgetting impossible. A missing ear might announce a history before the person spoke. The legal meaning of particular mutilations differed by region and century. Early and high medieval laws were especially varied. Some punishments belonged more strongly to particular kingdoms or legal traditions than others. Yet the concept was familiar. The body could carry judgment. For serious crimes, execution was also public. Hanging was common for certain offences in many parts of medieval Europe. Nobles might expect beheading under circumstances where lower status offenders faced the gallows, though reality was never perfectly orderly. Execution sites were often placed where roads or town approaches allowed them to be seen. Bodies could remain displayed. The dead continued the work of punishment. A traveller approaching a town might pass a gibbet. There, against an open sky, hung the warning. No written notice was needed. The meaning belonged to the landscape. Roads carried merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, beggars, and thieves. The gallows reminded all of them that local authority claimed the power to judge. Yet most medieval justice did not involve dramatic executions. Much of it was smaller, more ordinary. Manor courts settled disputes among tenants. Villagers were fined for failing to maintain ditches, allowing animals to damage crops, brewing against regulations, or neglecting communal duties. Neighbours accused neighbours. Jurors drawn from the local community reported offences. The same people who stood together during harvest might later stand in court while one described another's broken fence. A manor court could be held in a hall. Perhaps benches stood beneath dark beams. A clerk recorded names and payments. The Lord Steward presided. People waited. Someone was called. A fine was announced. Another case followed. There was no thrilling music, no dramatic speech. Justice could be deeply dull. That dullness made it powerful. It belonged to the regular rhythm of life. The bells sounded, fields were worked, ale was brewed, courts met, fines were paid. At times, communities used rituals of public correction that seem almost theatrical now. The cucking stool, and later the ducking stool in better-known forms, became associated with punishment for disorderly behaviour, especially accusations involving scolding women in some communities. The history of these devices is complicated, and modern images often mix medieval and early modern practices together. Historians continue to debate how frequently some famous punishments were actually used. Records can preserve a device without proving constant use. Still, public shaming had many forms. An offender might be required to stand in a particular garment. Objects connected to the offence could be displayed. A baker accused of selling bad bread might face symbolic humiliation. In some towns, defective goods were destroyed publicly. Punishment taught by making a story visible. The crowd became the audience and the memory. Religious discipline could also be public. A penitent might stand before a congregation. Sins could require visible acts of repentance. Pilgrimage itself was sometimes imposed as penance, sending a person along long muddy roads toward a shrine. A pilgrim's journey might therefore begin for many reasons: devotion, hope of healing, fulfillment of a vow, or judgment. A man who had committed an offence could be required to travel to a sacred place and return with proof. Pilgrim badges sometimes served as evidence that a shrine had been reached. The road became part of punishment. Cold rain, blisters, cheap lodging, uncertain food, weeks away from home. Modern people might imagine pilgrimage as peaceful spiritual tourism. For a medieval penitent, it could be exhausting and frightening. The religious world also shaped ideas of justice more deeply. Oaths were serious. Swearing falsely before God endangered not only earthly reputation but the soul. Relics could be present when oaths were taken. A hand placed near sacred remains transformed a statement into something far more dangerous than ordinary speech. Some people believed divine judgment might reveal guilt. Earlier medieval legal traditions had included ordeals involving hot iron or water, though these declined significantly after church opposition in the early 13th century. In an ordeal by hot iron, a person might carry heated metal and later have the wound examined. If healing appeared favourable, innocence could be declared. The practice seems horrifying. To those who trusted divine intervention, the logic was different. God knew the truth. Human judges did not. The ordeal invited heaven to reveal what people could not discover. No one can quite agree how confidently ordinary participants believed the result would be miraculous. Fear, custom, coercion, and faith probably mixed differently in every case. By the later medieval period, other systems of evidence and jury processes had become more important in many regions. Yet the memory of divine judgment remained. A guilty person might escape a court. Few believed he could escape God. Now the afternoon light begins to fade over a small town. The market has emptied. Stall boards are being lifted. A few crushed vegetables lie in the mud. Near the square, the stocks stand empty. Rain has darkened the wood. A church bell sounds, slow and deep. People cross themselves almost without pausing. Somewhere behind an oak door, a family eats pottage. Somewhere in a manor hall, a clerk closes a record book. A man fined that morning walks home through the dusk. aware that everyone he passes knows exactly what happened. The cruelty of public punishment did not always lie in pain. Sometimes it lay in recognition. There was nowhere to become anonymous. The baker remembered, the priest remembered, the neighbours remembered, the children heard the story, even the market square seemed to remember, because the wooden frame remained there after the offender had gone. Tomorrow, the space would fill again, ale would be sold, eggs would change hands, a market toll would be collected, someone would argue over a measure of grain, people would laugh quietly and bargain beneath the cold sky. And beside all this ordinary activity stood the instruments of correction, waiting without drama. Medieval people did not need to seek punishment in a distant prison. It occupied familiar places, the road, the gate, the hall, the square. Justice was woven into daily life so closely that a person might buy onions only a few steps from someone being publicly shamed. Then the bells marked another hour. The crowd moved on, and the punished remained, for a little while longer, beneath the eyes of everyone. Beyond the market square, usually not far from the bell tower, stood another place where medieval people encountered something modern life often tries to hide. The churchyard. It was not a distant cemetery beyond town. It was part of the settlement. People crossed near it on their way to worship. Children passed it. Merchants heard bells from beside it. Travellers used the church tower as a landmark while approaching along muddy roads. In some villages, the graves lay only a short walk from cottages where bread was baked and pottage simmered over the fire. Death lived close to ordinary life. A person might hear that a neighbour had died before breakfast. By midday, others were already preparing the body. There were no funeral homes in the modern sense. The dead commonly remained within the household or under the care of familiar people before burial, family members, neighbours, religious communities, or women experienced in laying out bodies performed the necessary work. The body might be washed, the eyes were closed, the limbs arranged, a cloth or shroud wrapped the dead. In wealthier households, funeral customs could become elaborate, involving candles, priests, heraldic display, and formal processions. For most people, death was quieter, a bed, a candle. A priest called if time allowed, relatives waiting beneath soot-dark rafters. The dying person might confess sins and receive the last rites according to the customs of the church. The moment mattered enormously. Medieval Christianity placed intense importance upon the condition of the soul at death. A sudden death could therefore be especially frightening. To die without confession, preparation, or reconciliation was not simply bad luck. It could be spiritually terrifying. People prayed for a good death. They prepared wills. They gave gifts to monasteries or churches. They asked for masses to be said afterward. Some left money for candles. Others requested burial near particular saints, altars, or religious houses. No one can quite agree how deeply every ordinary person understood the complex theology surrounding death and the afterlife. Priests preached. Images filled churches. Stories circulated around fires and along pilgrimage roads. The details may have blurred. The fear did not. A dying person could ask for a priest with urgency. The bell might be rung. Neighbours might pray. Then, when the breath stopped, the household continued to contain the body. This alone would horrify many modern visitors. The dead were familiar. A child might see a dead grandparent in the room where the family had eaten the previous evening. A servant could help carry the body. Neighbours entered. Prayers were spoken. The smell changed. In warm weather, burial could not be delayed for long. Without embalming techniques commonly available to ordinary people, the body began its natural decay. Herbs might be used. Cloths could be placed around the deceased. Incense and candles helped create a sacred atmosphere and perhaps softened unpleasant odours. But death remained physical. People saw what happened. They touched the dead. They carried them. The coffin itself was not always a permanent possession of the deceased. In some communities and periods, poorer people were buried in shrouds without individual wooden coffins. A reusable parish bier or coffin-like carrier might transport bodies to the grave. The body was then lowered into the earth. Wood was valuable, land was limited. Practicality entered even the rituals of mourning. Churchyards could become crowded. Generation after generation wanted burial in consecrated ground. People preferred places near churches or shrines. The wealthy sought prestigious locations. Space filled. Old graves were disturbed by new ones. Bones appeared. This was not always treated as a scandal. Human remains could be gathered and moved to charnel houses or ossuaries. Skulls and long bones were stacked. A person entering such a place might see the remains of hundreds or thousands of previous inhabitants. The sight seems deeply unsettling now. To medieval Christians, bones carried different meanings. They reminded the living of mortality. They also represented bodies waiting for resurrection. A skull was not merely a horror, it was a sermon without words. Remember death. Remember judgment. Remember that rank, beauty, and wealth would end. The phrase memento mori, the reminder of death, belonged to a broad spiritual culture that encouraged reflection on life's shortness. Church art showed decomposing bodies. Tombs sometimes displayed the dead not as beautiful sleeping nobles but as wasted corpses. These sculptures, often called transitombs or cadaver monuments, became especially striking in the later Middle Ages. A wealthy bishop or nobleman might commission an image of his own decaying body. That decision feels almost impossible to modern taste. Yet the message was deliberate. Look at me. This will happen to you. The lesson was not always intended to create despair. It encouraged preparation. A person who remembered death might confess, give alms, forgive an enemy, pray. In theory, mortality made the soul more attentive. In daily life, people probably reacted with every emotion humans have always felt: fear, grief, numbness, relief when long suffering ended, confusion, and sometimes simple exhaustion. A household still needed food after a death. Animals still needed feeding. Winter wood still had to be carried. Fields did not pause for mourning. The bells might toll and then work continued. One lesser-known custom involved the passing bell. In some places, bells were rung when a person was dying or had died, calling others to prayer. Different patterns could indicate distinctions such as sex or status. Although practices varied between parishes, the sound carried across fields. A farmer hearing it might stop briefly. Someone in a cottage crossed herself. A monk heard the note inside an abbey cloister. Perhaps no one knew immediately who had died. The bell announced absence before the name arrived. Death also travelled along roads. Pilgrims died in inns. Soldiers died far from home. Merchants disappeared between towns. Travellers drowned crossing rivers or froze during winter journeys. Not everyone returned to a family grave. Roadside crosses sometimes marked places of sudden death. Shrines grew around remembered tragedies or reputed miracles. A person walking through a forest could pass a place where local tradition claimed someone had been murdered generations earlier. Some chroniclers claimed restless spirits haunted roads where the dead had received improper burial. Ghost stories were common. The medieval dead were not always believed to remain quietly underground. There were tales of revenants, corpses said to return and trouble the living. In parts of northern Europe, stories described dead men leaving graves, spreading sickness, or attacking neighbours. historians continue to debate how literally communities believed such accounts. Clerical writers may have shaped local stories into religious examples, and oral traditions change through retelling. Still, unusual burial practices sometimes suggest genuine fear. Bodies believed dangerous could be pinned, weighted, or treated in ways intended to prevent their return. A corpse might be decapitated, stones placed upon it. In other contexts, disturbed burials have entirely practical or unrelated explanations, so archaeologists remain cautious. But the stories endured. At night, churchyards were not empty in imagination. A person hurrying home after the final bell might avoid looking between the graves. Moonlight touched the stones, yew branches shifted, an owl called. The living walked faster. Yet by daylight, the same churchyard returned to ordinary life. People met near the church door, announcements were heard, disputes began. Animals sometimes wandered where they should not. The sacred and the everyday existed almost on top of one another. Relics brought death even closer. A saint's bone, tooth, fragment of skull, or other bodily remains could be among a church's greatest treasures. Relics were placed in decorated containers called reliquaries. Pilgrims travelled enormous distances to see them. They prayed nearby, they touched containers, they purchased pilgrim badges to mark the journey. The remains of a holy person were not considered dirty or frightening. They were powerful. A saint's body had been close to holiness. Miracles might occur near the tomb. The sick came hoping to be healed. A monastery possessing important relics could attract crowds and donations. Of course, questions arose about authenticity. There were competing claims. More than one church could insist it possessed the same saint's bone. Some chroniclers mocked doubtful relics, and church authorities sometimes investigated suspicious claims. Even now, historians continue to debate the origins of many surviving relics. For the pilgrim kneeling by candlelight, certainty could feel less important. Faith had already carried him across muddy roads. He had slept in shared beds, eaten coarse bread, past gibbets and roadside shrines. Now a gilded box stood before him. Inside lay a piece of the dead. He prayed. Outside, evening slowly covered the town. The church bell sounded through mist. In the churchyard, the newest grave remained darker than the earth around it. A family had gone home. The dead stayed behind. Nearby, older bones rested beneath newer burials. Inside the church, a saint's relic waited among candles. Death was everywhere, not hidden, not transported to distant buildings, not carefully removed from the streets of the living. It sat beside beds, passed through doorways, filled churchyards, hung in reliquaries, marked roads, spoke from bells. Medieval people feared death deeply, but they also knew its face. And as the last candle in a cottage burned lower, a family could fall asleep only a few fields from generations of neighbours beneath the earth, while the church tower stood above them all, keeping time for the living and the dead together. The children who passed through those churchyards did not remain children for very long, at least not in the way modern societies often understand childhood. They played, they laughed, they chased animals through yards, made toys from wood and bone, rolled hoops, threw stones, sang rhymes, and turned almost any open space into a place of noisy invention. Medieval manuscripts show children with spinning tops, balls, hobby horses, and dolls. Archaeologists have found tiny objects that may once have belonged to young hands. A small wooden sword could transform a muddy lane into an imagined battlefield. Knuckle bones became gaming pieces. A broken pot might become something else entirely before an adult noticed it was gone. Childhood existed. Affection existed. Parents grieved terribly when sons and daughters died. But childhood was shorter in its protections. A child who could carry something was useful. A child who could watch an animal was useful. A child old enough to follow instructions could begin learning the work that would shape the rest of life. No one can quite agree at what age medieval childhood truly ended, because law, religion, household custom, and economic necessity all drew different boundaries. A 7-year-old might still be considered very young in one context, while already trusted with regular tasks in another. By adolescence, many young people were deeply embedded in adult work. In a village, children learned by being near labour. There was rarely a special educational moment in which someone announced that farming would now be explained. A boy watched his father repair a fence. A girl observed her mother prepare pottage, spin thread, preserve food, and manage household stores. These patterns were common, though they were not rigid everywhere. Women worked in fields, men cooked in particular settings. Widows managed businesses. Children learned whatever their household needed. Knowledge arrived through repetition. Hold this, carry that, watch the geese, turn the grain, gather sticks, do not let the fire die. A child might begin with a task so small that it barely looked like work. Then the responsibility grew. Livestock offered endless opportunities for young labour. Geese had to be watched. Pigs could be driven. Sheep needed attention. A child sent to guard animals might spend hours outside. Far from constant adult supervision, the countryside was not a safe enclosed garden. There were streams, wells, woods, boggy ground, aggressive animals, carts, horses, farm tools, winter cold. A small mistake could become serious. Court records sometimes preserve accidental deaths in painful detail because an official inquiry followed an unexpected death. Children drowned in wells and rivers. They were kicked or crushed by animals. They fell into fires. Carts rolled over them. The records are chilling precisely because the events sound ordinary. A mother was working. A father had gone to the fields. A child was near a horse. Then life divided into before and after. Modern readers may wonder why anyone allowed children so close to danger. The answer is partly that danger was everywhere and supervision required time. A household that survived through labour needed nearly every capable person to contribute. The field did not stop because a child required watching. Bread still needed to be prepared. Water still had to be carried. A woman tending several children while also spinning, brewing, feeding animals, and working seasonally in agriculture could not keep every young person within arm's reach. Older children watched younger ones. This was another form of early responsibility. A girl not yet grown might carry a baby while an adult worked nearby. An older brother could be told to keep a younger child away from the road or stream. These arrangements sometimes succeeded. Sometimes they did not. The uncertainty belonged to ordinary life. Education depended heavily upon family and status. A noble child might learn reading, religion, music, manners, riding, hunting, or military skills according to sex, household expectations, and individual circumstances. A boy of noble birth could be sent to another lord's household as a page. There he learned service, he carried messages, waited at table, observed horses and weapons, absorbed the manners of elite society. Later, some became squires. The romantic image of a young squire polishing a shining sword beside a heroic knight hides the physical reality. Armour was heavy, horses were large, weapons were dangerous. Military training involved falls, bruises, cuts, and exhaustion. A teenager preparing for war was learning how to injure another human being while also learning how not to be injured himself. For children of craftsmen, apprenticeship created a different path. A boy, and sometimes a girl depending upon the trade and local custom, could leave the parental household to live with a master. An apprenticeship might last years. The apprentice entered a new home and a new hierarchy. The master taught a craft. He also exercised authority. A young apprentice learned through work. Sweep the shop, carry materials, observe, repeat, make mistakes, repeat again. A goldsmith's apprentice handled valuable substances under strict supervision. A baker's apprentice rose early. A weaver's household worked around looms and thread. A smithy surrounded a young worker with heat, sparks, iron, smoke, and heavy tools. Fingers were vulnerable everywhere. There were no safety goggles, no machine guards, no modern emergency department waiting beyond the workshop door. Even simple trades carried hazards. A knife slipped, a splinter entered the hand, a burn blistered, a wound became infected. The young person was treated with whatever remedies the household trusted and, when able, returned to work. Some apprenticeship contracts and guild rules attempted to regulate treatment. Masters had obligations. Apprentices had protections in certain towns. Yet legal ideals and daily behaviour were not always identical. Some masters were patient, others were harsh. Beating children as discipline was widely accepted in many medieval settings. The rod carried moral significance. Religious and educational texts could present physical correction as necessary for shaping character. Parents, teachers, and masters lived in cultures where striking a young person did not automatically provoke the moral horror it often does today. There were limits, at least in theory. Excessive violence could produce complaints. A child seriously injured by a master might become a legal concern. But the boundary between correction and cruelty was uncertain. Those who recorded such disputes never fully agreed on where acceptable discipline ended. A schoolboy learning Latin might be beaten for errors. The image of medieval education as rows of silent, obedient children is misleading. Students misbehaved. They whispered, fought, skipped lessons. A schoolmaster carried a rod partly because medieval boys behaved like boys. Yet fear could sit beside learning. A mistake in grammar might bring pain. A forgotten passage could be remembered very quickly after punishment. One lesser-known educational custom was the use of hornbooks in later medieval and early modern learning traditions. A sheet containing letters or prayers could be protected beneath a thin layer of translucent horn and fixed to a wooden board. The object was durable. A young learner repeated letters and religious texts again and again. For many medieval children who learned to read, religion shaped the earliest words. The Pater Noster, the Ave Maria, the Creed, the church bell divided time. Saints' days shaped the calendar. Children learned not only how to work but how to fear sin, judgment, demons, and sudden death. Stories warned them. A saint rewarded obedience. A wicked person met an awful end. Strange lights could be omens. A roadside shrine deserved respect. Some children carried small charms or objects intended for protection. Parents prayed to saints when children were ill. Pilgrimage records contain stories of desperate mothers and fathers travelling to shrines after accidents or sickness. Medieval parents were not indifferent. Their world simply gave them fewer ways to protect. Now evening settles over a village lane. A young shepherd returns with cold hands and mud dried around his shoes. A girl carries a smaller child toward the cottage door while smoke moves from the roof. Near the manor, an older boy leads a horse into a stable. Farther away, in a town workshop, an apprentice sweeps wood shavings from the floor before the shutters close. The bells begin to sound. Children hear them as adults do. They know what the hour means. Work is ending. Prayer is approaching. Darkness is coming. Inside a cottage, a mother checks a child's scratched hand. Perhaps she washes it with water, Perhaps she adds an herbal salve. Perhaps an old charm is spoken because a grandmother insists it helped once before. Some chroniclers claimed particular prayers could stop bleeding when correctly recited. Whether people believed the words themselves possessed power or trusted the saint invoked through them is difficult to know. The child listens. Tomorrow, the hand will still be needed. That is the quiet severity of medieval childhood. A young person could be loved deeply and still be expected to endure cold, to work while tired, to obey immediately, to accept blows, to walk long distances, to care for animals stronger than himself, to watch death enter the household, to become useful early. There was little idea that childhood should be protected from every harsh truth. The harsh truths lived inside the same room, the empty grain chest, the sick cow, the father's injured leg, the new grave near the church. A child saw them and slowly understood what was required. By the fire, stories were told, games were played, a sleepy head rested against an older shoulder. Then morning bells arrived. The child stood. A cloak was fastened. A piece of bread was eaten. Outside, frost covered the path, and small footprints followed the larger ones toward the work of the day. Those small footprints crossed a world in which faith did not wait quietly inside the church. It followed people into fields, into kitchens, across bridges, along pilgrimage roads. It hung around the neck in the form of a tiny cross or charm. It rested inside a wooden chest beside linen and coins. It appeared in painted saints above altars, in bells sounding over winter fields, and in the whispered words spoken when someone woke suddenly from a troubling dream. For medieval people, the visible world and the invisible world often stood very close together. A modern person might hear a strange noise in the roof and think of loose timber, nesting birds, or rats. A medieval household could think of all these things, and perhaps something else. A spirit, an omen, a warning. No one can quite agree how literally every medieval person accepted every supernatural story. Skepticism certainly existed. Clerics complained about foolish beliefs. Educated writers mocked certain village customs. One neighbour may have trusted an old charm completely while another quietly doubted it. Yet belief shaped daily choices because uncertainty was everywhere. A crop failed. Why, perhaps the rain had been wrong. Perhaps the seed was poor. Perhaps the soil had weakened. Perhaps God was displeased. Perhaps envy had brought a curse. Perhaps someone had looked upon the field with evil eye. When the cause of misfortune could not be seen, explanation moved easily beyond the visible. The church offered a vast sacred landscape. Saints watched over particular illnesses, professions, and dangers. Saint Christopher became associated with travellers. Saint Blay was invoked for ailments of the throat. Saint Apollonia was connected with toothache, partly because traditions of her martyrdom described the violent destruction of her teeth. A person suffering through a sleepless night with the swollen jaw might pray to her. The prayer did not prevent someone from also seeking a tooth puller. Medieval people were capable of using several kinds of hope at once: a herb, a saint, a charm, a pilgrimage. If one failed, perhaps another would succeed. Relics carried special importance. A church might possess a fragment believed to be part of a saint's bone, clothing, or another object connected with holy life. Pilgrims travelled to stand near such remains. They knelt in candlelit chapels where beeswax softened in the warmth and smoke gathered slowly near stone arches. Some touched the reliquary, some brought cloth to press against it, some carried water or oil associated with a shrine home afterward. Pilgrim badges were bought and fastened to cloaks or hats. These small metal objects showed where a traveller had been. A scallop shell became closely associated with Santiago de Compostela. Thomas Becket's shrine at Canterbury inspired badges and small containers linked with the saint's cult. A returning pilgrim carried proof of distance crossed, but the badge was more than a souvenir. It might be treated as protective. Perhaps the holiness of the place remained attached in some fashion. Historians continue to debate how ordinary pilgrims understood the precise power of such objects. The theology taught by clergy and the beliefs carried from village to village were not always identical. A priest might say that God worked through the saint. A villager might treat the badge itself with nervous respect. Along muddy roads, these distinctions could become very thin. Travel was dangerous. A pilgrim crossed rivers, passed forests, slept in unfamiliar rooms, shared bread with strangers, heard wolves in distant hills. A badge on the cloak offered identity and perhaps reassurance. Roadside shrines gave travellers places to pause. A small image of the Virgin might stand beneath a wooden shelter. A stone cross marked a junction. Someone had left flowers. A scrap of cloth had been tied nearby. A candle stub showed that another traveller had stopped earlier. The pilgrim crossed himself, then continued. Not every practice pleased the clergy. Village traditions could combine Christianity with older habits whose origins were difficult to trace. People visited wells believed to possess healing power. They tied strips of cloth to branches. They carried written words against the body. Some placed herbs beneath thresholds. Iron objects were sometimes treated as protective. A horseshoe, in later traditions, gained strong associations with luck, though tracing particular beliefs into the medieval period is difficult. Those who recorded the story never fully agreed because folk customs rarely entered official documents unless someone complained about them. Clerical complaints, however, are revealing. Priests and bishops repeatedly warned against divination, charms, magical words, and consulting suspicious healers. The repetition suggests the custom survived. A person worried about a missing animal might visit someone believed able to discover hidden things. A young woman anxious about marriage could seek a sign. A farmer might remember the behavior of birds before a storm. Dreams were examined. Unusual births were discussed. Comets created fear. An eclipse could turn a familiar afternoon into a moment of collective unease. Even learned people studied the heavens. Astrology was not always treated as simple superstition. Universities taught forms of natural philosophy influenced by ancient authorities. Physicians considered planetary positions when judging treatment. Calendars marked favourable and unfavourable days. The boundary between accepted knowledge and condemned magic shifted according to method, intention, and authority. A physician consulting the stars might be respected. A village woman muttering over a bowl of water might be accused of dangerous practices. The difference was not merely belief. It was social position, education, gender, reputation, and sometimes luck. Accusations of witchcraft existed in the medieval period, though the enormous witch-hunting panics more often associated with Europe intensified mainly in the early modern centuries. Medieval beliefs about harmful magic were still serious. A failed cow, a child suddenly ill, butter that would not form, a marriage filled with conflict. When ordinary explanation failed, suspicion could settle upon another person. Often it settled upon someone already disliked, an isolated woman, a quarrelsome neighbour, a stranger, a healer whose remedy had failed. No one can quite agree how commonly village disputes turned into formal accusations, because many suspicions were probably never written down. But fear did not need a court to damage a life. A whispered reputation could travel quickly. The same community that helped during harvest could also become watchful. People observed one another. They remembered arguments. If a man cursed his neighbour and the neighbour's horse died 3 days later, coincidence might not feel convincing. Words carried weight. Blessings did too. Before a journey, a person might seek a priest's blessing. Fields were blessed. Animals could be blessed. Holy water entered homes. Palm branches from church observances might be kept. Wax from sacred candles could acquire protective associations. The ordinary medieval household contained objects modern people might divide into religion, medicine, and superstition. The household itself made no such neat shelves. A sprig of herb hung near the wall, a cross stood nearby, a charm was folded into cloth, a saint's image watched from a painted board. The fire cracked beneath a pot of pottage. All belonged to one world. Night intensified these beliefs. When candles were extinguished, darkness became nearly complete. Moonlight entered only through small windows or shutters. Beyond the walls lay roads, churchyards, fields, and forests. An owl called. Dogs barked at something unseen. Timber shifted in the cold. A sleeping person woke from a nightmare and lay still beneath a wool blanket. Dreams could be meaningful. Some were thought to warn of illness or death. Others were blamed upon food, bodily imbalance, or spiritual danger. Medieval dream books offered interpretations. To dream of particular animals, colours, or events could be treated as a sign. The exact meanings varied, and some chroniclers openly doubted such systems. Yet after a vivid dream, doubt could weaken before sunrise. A person might rise and pray. The bell for the first office sounded from a monastery in the distance. Its note moved through darkness. For monks. The bell called the community into a carefully ordered cycle of prayer. For villagers nearby, the same sound could offer comfort. The church was awake. Somewhere, candles burned. Voices recited familiar words. The night was not entirely abandoned. That may help explain the deep importance of bells. They marked time, warned of danger, announced death, called people to worship. During storms, bells were sometimes rung because people believed sacred sound might protect communities from destructive weather. The belief was strong enough that bell ringing during dangerous storms continued in some places despite obvious risks to those climbing towers. Lightning did not respect devotion. Still, the bell sounded. Metal rang over roofs and wet fields while thunder moved in the distance. A medieval village had few ways to confront a violent storm. People watched crops flatten, roofs lift, trees break. Prayer gave the terror a shape. Sacred sound gave the community something to do. So they rang. They crossed themselves. They invoked saints. They placed trust wherever trust could be placed. Now moonlight lies over the stone church. The village has gone quiet. A dog sleeps near an oak door. Inside one cottage, a small pilgrim badge hangs from a wooden peg beside a cloak. On another wall, dried herbs have been tied in a bundle. An old woman murmurs a prayer before lying down. Perhaps every word is approved by the parish priest. Perhaps one phrase came from her grandmother and would make the priest uncomfortable. She knows only that it has been spoken for years. Outside, mist moves across the winter fields. The bell sounds once more. Faith, fear, memory, medicine, and superstition settle together beneath the same dark roofs. To modern eyes, some of these beliefs seem strange. To medieval people, the stranger thing might have been to face such an uncertain world without them. The pilgrim badge hanging beside the cloak had not appeared there easily. Before it returned to the cottage wall, it had crossed roads. Long roads. Wet roads. Roads that disappeared beneath winter mud, narrowed between hedges, climbed through forests, and sometimes became little more than 2 deep cart ruts cutting across open land. Travel in the medieval world was rarely comfortable. Most people walked. A horse was valuable, and maintaining one required feed, equipment, and care. Merchants, nobles, messengers, clerics, and soldiers might ride, but countless pilgrims and ordinary travellers moved on foot. Their shoes wore thin, leather softened in rain, mud entered through cracks. A person leaving a village in the morning could spend the entire day watching the next church tower grow slowly larger without ever seeming to arrive. Distance was felt in the body. A journey of 20 miles was not an abstract measurement. It was a blister, a stiff knee, a damp cloak, an empty stomach. No one can quite agree how far an average medieval traveller walked in a single day because roads, weather, age, burden, and purpose changed everything. A determined messenger could cover impressive distances. A pilgrim travelling with elderly companions moved more slowly. Winter shortened the day. Summer heat exhausted both humans and animals. Rain changed the road itself. A dry track that supported a cart in August could become a trench of brown water by November. Wheels sank, horses struggled, travellers stepped into fields to avoid the deepest sections, sometimes damaging crops and angering landowners. Bridges were valuable precisely because rivers were dangerous. A stone bridge could become an important landmark, market point, or source of tolls. Wooden bridges required repair. Smaller streams were crossed by fords. A ford looked harmless when water was low. After rain, it could kill. Travellers misjudged depth. Horses lost footing. Carts overturned. A cloak became heavy once soaked. Even strong swimmers faced currents, cold water, and boots that seemed determined to pull the body downward. People therefore gathered information. At an inn, someone asked about the road ahead. Was the bridge passable? Had the river risen? Were thieves active near the forest? Was a particular abbey still accepting pilgrims? Had anyone travelled from the next town recently? News moved from mouth to mouth. A merchant arriving at dusk became valuable not only for the goods in his pack, but for what he had seen. Some chroniclers claimed certain roads were filled with robbers waiting behind every tree. The reality was probably less dramatic on most days. Highway robbery existed, certainly, and periods of war or weak local authority made travel more dangerous. But medieval travellers were also surrounded by ordinary people, farmers, carters, shepherds, monks, toll collectors, other pilgrims. The fear came from not knowing which person was safe. A traveller might join a group for companionship. Pilgrims often moved together. The group shared information, helped during illness, and looked less inviting to thieves. Yet companions created problems too. A stranger could steal. A quarrel could begin over money or food. One person walked too slowly, another snored. Someone carried lice into the shared lodging. The road demanded tolerance. At sunset, shelter became urgent. An inn offered possibilities. The building might stand near a town gate, bridge, or busy route. Smoke rose from the roof. Horses were led toward a stable. Inside, ale was poured and food appeared if the kitchen had anything ready. A traveller entered carrying the entire road upon his clothing. Mud on the shoes, rain in the cloak, sweat beneath wool, dust in the hair. He was not alone. The inn collected smells from every direction. Wet leather, horse tack, smoke, ale, pottage, garlic, straw, human bodies, perhaps smoked fish, perhaps a dog waiting beneath a table. The sleeping arrangements could be worse. Private rooms were not guaranteed. Beds might be shared. A traveller could pay for a place beside someone he had never met. Sometimes several people occupied one large bed. There was practical logic in this. Beds were expensive, space was limited, warmth mattered, but to a modern person, lying beneath unfamiliar blankets beside a stranger from another town would be difficult enough without considering the fleas. Bedding in a busy inn met a constant stream of bodies. Travellers arrived from villages, markets, ports, and pilgrimage routes. Their parasites travelled free of charge. One lesser-known travel precaution involved carrying one's own bedding or blankets when status and resources allowed. Wealthier travellers sometimes moved with substantial household equipment, servants, and supplies. A great noble on the road did not simply arrive with a small bag. Beds, textiles, cooking vessels, clothing, and other necessities could form part of a moving household. Poor pilgrims carried far less. A cloak might serve as bedding. A bundle became a pillow. If an inn was full, a barn could be sufficient. Monasteries provided hospitality according to their rules and resources. The rule of St. Benedict's instructed that guests be received with care, and monastic hospitality became an important part of medieval travel. Yet an abbey was not a modern hotel. A crowded religious house could not offer luxury to every muddy traveller who appeared after sunset. Guest houses varied. Some were well organised. Others provided basic shelter. The poor might receive simpler treatment than important visitors, despite ideals of Christian charity. Even now, historians continue to debate how evenly hospitality was extended in practice. Still, the sight of an abbey near evening could bring relief. A wall, a gate, a bell. People who followed an order. Food, perhaps. A place away from the open road. The pilgrim entered. His shoes were wet. Someone directed him toward shelter. He might attend prayer. He might eat bread and pottage. If fortunate, there was ale. If ill, he could perhaps be seen by someone connected with the infirmary. Then darkness settled beyond the monastery walls. Outside, the road remained empty. Wind moved through trees. Rain tapped slowly against wooden roofs. The bells sounded according to the monastic hours, waking brothers from sleep and calling them into prayer. For a traveller unused to the rhythm, the bells might seem to divide the night into pieces. He turned beneath a blanket. Someone coughed nearby. Another guest whispered a prayer. Morning came too soon. Then the road resumed. Food was a constant concern. A traveller carried bread, cheese, onions, dried meat, or smoked fish if available. But food was heavy. It spoiled. A pilgrim walking for weeks depended upon places along the route, markets, inns, monasteries, village generosity, charity. Some begged. Religious pilgrims could hope that their visible badges, staffs, and clothing encouraged assistance. Not everyone welcomed them. Medieval complaints about false pilgrims reveal suspicion toward travellers pretending to be devout while living through begging or theft. A stranger always raised questions. Where had he come from? Why was he travelling? Did he carry news? Was he escaping someone? Was the badge genuine? The road loosened people from the reputations that controlled village life. At home, everyone knew a man's father. On a distant road, he could say almost anything. This freedom was unsettling. It was also attractive. Stories grew around travellers because travellers carried possibilities. A returning pilgrim described foreign churches. A merchant spoke of cities beyond the sea. A soldier remembered places no one else in the village had seen. Truth and exaggeration travelled together. One evening, beside a watchfire, a group might listen to a man describe wolves following him through a forest. Some chroniclers claimed wolves regularly threatened lone travellers in certain regions, especially during harsh winters. Historians remain cautious about the more dramatic stories. Wolves usually avoided people. Usually was not always comforting on a dark road. Forests felt different after sunset. Paths disappeared. Branches hid the sky. A traveller knew stories of robbers, spirits, and animals. He also knew the very real danger of becoming lost. There were no glowing road signs, no map in every pocket. Directions depended upon landmarks. Follow the river, turn near the stone cross, pass the manor, keep the church tower to the left, ask at the mill. A wrong path could cost hours. In winter, those hours mattered. Cold killed quietly. A traveller wet from rain lost warmth. Wind entered beneath the cloak. Fingers became stiff. The temptation to sit down increased. Roadside deaths were part of the medieval landscape. A cross might mark the place where someone had died. The story remained after the person's name had faded. Now imagine the road in the final light of evening. Mud reflects a pale sky. Bare branches move above a small shrine beside the path. 3 pilgrims walk together, their cloaks darkened by rain. One limps. Another carries a staff polished by weeks of use. A small lead badge is fixed to the third traveller's hat. Ahead, far beyond the fields, a bell sounds. They stop. Listen. The sound comes again. A village, perhaps an abbey. Shelter. The 3 continue. Their feet hurt. Their bread is nearly gone. They do not know who will share their room tonight or whether the bedding will crawl with fleas. They do not know if tomorrow's river will be passable. They only know that the bell is ahead, so they walk toward it. For medieval travellers, misery was not evidence that a journey had failed. Cold, hunger, blisters, bad inns, shared beds, and dangerous roads were expected companions. The remarkable thing was not that travel hurt. The remarkable thing was that people kept going. Toward markets, toward courts, toward war, toward family, toward saints. And as darkness gathered over the muddy road, the pilgrims followed the fading bell, one careful step after another. The pilgrims followed the bell because somewhere beyond the rain there would be walls. Walls promised shelter. Yet in winter, a medieval wall could be a cold companion. Stone held the memory of the night. It gathered dampness, resisted sunlight, and seemed to release chill slowly into rooms long after a fire had been lit. A castle seen from a distant road might appear magnificent against a pale sky. Its towers rising above frozen fields, banners moving in the wind. Inside, magnificence did not always mean warmth. Great halls were large. Their ceilings rose high above the floor. Doors opened often as servants, guards, clerks, messengers, and dogs passed through. Early halls relied upon central hearths or large fireplaces, and smoke found its way upward toward roof vents, rafters, and every surface it could darken. A fire warmed the people nearest to it. The corners remained cold. A nobleman seated close to the hearth could feel heat against one side of his body, while a draught touched the other. Fur-lined cloaks were not simply decorative expressions of status. Fur trapped warmth. Wool did too. Layers mattered. A person dressed for a castle hall in January might wear linen close to the skin, wool over it, and another garment above that. Those who could afford fur used it at collars, cuffs, linings, and within cloaks. Still, fingers became cold, noses reddened, ink thickened. Water in basins could turn painfully cold during the night. No one can quite agree how often particular castle rooms fell near freezing, because temperature depended upon architecture, weather, fuel, and occupation. A crowded chamber filled with people, candles, and a strong fire felt different from an empty tower room facing a northern wind. But cold was accepted as part of winter. Tapestries helped. Popular imagination often treats medieval wall hangings entirely as decoration. Yet heavy textiles also reduced the feeling of cold radiating from stone and softened drafts. Beds were surrounded by curtains for similar reasons. A wealthy bed with thick coverings and enclosed fabric could create a small pocket of warmth around sleepers. The rest of the chamber waited outside the curtains. Morning was the difficult part. Someone had to leave the bed. A servant might rise first. Shoes touched a cold floor. The fire had burned low. Ash covered the remaining embers. The servant crouched, added tinder, perhaps blew gently, and hoped the hidden glow had survived. Starting a fire from nothing required more effort than preserving one. Households therefore guarded embers. Tinder boxes held useful materials. Flint and steel produced sparks, but catching those sparks and nursing them into flame required dry tinder and patience. One lesser-known object associated with fire-making was charred cloth, prepared so that a spark could catch easily. Other forms of tinder included dried plant material, fungus, or fine fibres. Fire was a skill. A poorly managed hearth meant a colder morning. Fuel was the greater problem. Wood had to be cut, branches gathered, logs split, carts loaded. Forests were controlled by rights and customs. Peasants could not simply enter every woodland and take whatever they pleased. Lords claimed timber, communities regulated access. Deadwood rights mattered. So did peat in regions where it was available. In treeless areas, people burned turf or other materials. Even dried animal dung could serve as fuel in certain circumstances and places. A warm room represented labour performed long before winter. Someone had spent summer and autumn gathering what the fire now consumed. This encouraged thrift. A family did not always build the largest possible blaze merely because the night was cold. The fuel had to last. In a cottage, the family gathered close. There might be only one main heated room. Smoke from the hearth entered clothing and hair. If the house lacked an effective chimney, the upper space beneath the roof became dark with soot. The fire cooked pottage, dried damp shoes. Heated water provided light. Its warmth was only one of several jobs. A pot hanging above the flames could not be ignored simply because someone's feet were cold. People arranged their bodies according to heat. Older family members took favoured places. A stool was pulled closer. A child sat on the floor near the hearth. The dog had already found the best location and would surrender it only under protest. Beyond the circle of firelight, the cottage faded into shadow. A wooden chest felt cold to the touch. Blankets stored against a damp wall absorbed moisture. Straw bedding had to be kept as dry as possible. When wool became wet, it grew heavy and uncomfortable, though it could still offer some insulation. Winter rain was often worse than clean snow. A traveller arrived soaked. A farmer returned with mud to the knees. Cloaks hung near the hearth. Steam rose slowly. The room filled with the smell of wet wool. People slept beside clothing that might still be damp in the morning. Some chroniclers claimed severe winters froze rivers for long periods and destroyed vines, orchards, or livestock. Specific descriptions may exaggerate unusual weather, but Europe did experience periods of significant climatic variation during the later Middle Ages. Even now, historians continue to debate the exact local effects of what is often called the Little Ice Age, especially its beginning and how consistently colder conditions were felt across regions. Ordinary people did not need a name for climate patterns. They knew when winter lasted too long. The grain stores shrank, fuel disappeared, animals needed feed, roads froze, thawed, and turned to mud. A late frost could damage crops before the growing season had properly begun. Cold inside a house was therefore connected to fear outside it. How much wood remained? How much grain would the cow survive? Could the roof withstand another storm? A monastery faced winter differently. Religious communities followed rules and routines that did not stop for weather. Bells sounded during dark hours. Monks rose for prayer. The dormitory could be cold. Some monasteries had warming rooms, known in Latin as calefactories, where a fire provided relief. In certain communities, this might be one of the few regularly heated spaces apart from kitchens, infirmaries, and other necessary rooms. The existence of a warming room tells its own story. Warmth was concentrated. A monk could go toward it. He did not expect the entire abbey to feel comfortable. Stone cloisters opened around courtyards where snow or rain collected. Covered walks protected monks from direct weather but not from every draught. Hands disappeared into sleeves. Breath became visible. The monastery bell sounded. Prayer continued. Rules concerning clothing varied, and communities adapted to local climate. Additional garments could be permitted in colder regions. Blankets were regulated. Religious discipline did not require every monk to freeze to death. But comfort was not the highest objective. Enduring cold could acquire spiritual meaning. The body complained. The soul practiced obedience. Not every monk welcomed this lesson. Medieval monks left enough complaints, requests, and disciplinary records to remind us that religious habits did not eliminate ordinary human preference for a warm room. The infirmary received special consideration. The sick needed heat. Food could be adjusted. Rest allowed. A monk burning with fever or weakened by illness was treated differently from a healthy brother grumbling about frozen fingers. In manor houses, social rank shaped access to warmth. The Lord's chamber might have a fireplace. The great hall held the principal fire. Servants slept where space permitted. Some rested on pallets near warmer areas. Others occupied lofts, side rooms, or quarters where cold penetrated easily. A kitchen worker could spend the day sweating near ovens and then sleep in a room cold enough to make the contrast cruel. Fire also created danger. Sparks reached rushes, timber dried, clothing caught. A person sleeping too close to a hearth risked burns. Town fires could destroy rows of buildings. Thus the source of winter comfort was itself something to watch carefully. Night settles now over a manor house. Snow has begun to fall. It rests on the courtyard stones and gathers on the roof of the chapel. Inside the hall, the final meal is ending. A servant carries away wooden bowls. Another adds a log to the fire. The flame brightens and casts moving light across old beams. Beyond the hearth, shadows remain. A woman draws her cloak more closely around her shoulders. Someone rubs cold hands together. The wind presses against shutters. Far away, the church bell sounds through snow. Soon people will go to bed beneath wool blankets, and in wealthier chambers, behind curtains, bodies will share warmth, bedclothes will be piled high. A warming pan filled with hot coals might be moved through a bed in later medieval and subsequent households, though such equipment was hardly available to everyone and had to be used carefully. For poorer people, there was the oldest warming method of all: get close. A family slept close together. A servant shared a bed. A traveller accepted the stranger already beneath the blanket. Cold made privacy seem less important. By dawn, frost might appear inside poorly protected openings. Water would feel sharp against the hands. Shoes would be stiff. The first breath beyond the blanket would be unpleasant. Then someone would rise. The fire would be found beneath ash. A spark would catch. Smoke would curl upward. The bell would sound. And across castles, cottages, abbeys, and manor houses. Medieval people would begin another winter day in rooms far colder than most modern people willingly tolerate. They did not conquer winter. They dressed against it, burned what fuel they could spare, hung cloth against stone, shared beds, gathered near fires, and waited. Outside, snow covered the road until old footprints disappeared. Inside, the last flame settled lower. The room cooled slowly, and beneath heavy wool, the sleeping household drew closer together while the long, medieval winter pressed quietly against the walls. When winter finally loosened its grip and roads began to soften beneath spring rain, people stepped outside carrying the same habits, tools, and tempers that had waited with them beside the fire. The village awakened. Fields needed work. Fences required repair. Animals were driven outward. Markets returned to fuller life. And with greater movement came another ordinary feature of medieval existence that modern people might find deeply unsettling. Violence was close, not always spectacular, not always fatal. Often it appeared in forms so familiar that the people witnessing it did not stop their day for long. A quarrel began over a boundary. Two men argued beside a strip of farmland. One claimed a hedge had been moved, the other denied it. Voices rose, neighbours gathered. Perhaps the manor court would settle the matter later. Perhaps one man struck first. A fist, a staff, a farming tool lifted in anger. No one can quite agree how violent the average medieval community truly was. Legal records naturally preserve assaults because peaceful afternoons rarely required a clerk to record them. Some historians warn that surviving court cases can make the past appear more violent simply because conflict leaves better documents than quiet cooperation. Still, weapons were common objects. A knife belonged to daily life. People used knives at meals. They cut rope, trimmed wood, prepared food, worked leather. A knife worn at the belt was a tool before it became a weapon. That meant violence could become dangerous very quickly. A modern argument in a shop might end with shouting. A medieval argument in a market could involve two people who both carried blades as part of ordinary clothing. Authorities knew the risk. Town regulations sometimes restricted the carrying of particular weapons, especially at night or during public gatherings. The details varied by city and period. Swords carried strong associations with status and military life, while ordinary people were more likely to possess knives, staffs, bows, axes, or agricultural implements. But almost any tool could become dangerous. The same axe that split winter fuel could split bone. The same staff that supported a traveller on muddy roads could be used in a fight. The transformation required only anger. Ale sometimes helped. Taverns and inns gathered strangers, apprentices, labourers, soldiers, and travellers into warm rooms where drink loosened judgment. Most evenings ended without blood. Yet legal records repeatedly mention fights connected with drinking. An insult was heard, a debt remembered, a game turned bitter. Someone claimed another man had cheated. Then stools moved, a jug fell. People tried to separate the quarrel, or they joined it. Those who recorded the story never fully agreed about how authorities understood drunken violence. Ale was an accepted part of daily consumption in many places, but excessive drinking was condemned by preachers and officials. The drink itself was ordinary. Losing control was the sin. Even then, communities sometimes treated fighting as a problem of disorder rather than evidence that the participants were fundamentally dangerous people. A man could assault a neighbour and later continue living near him. They still attended the same church. Their animals shared paths. Their families met at markets. There was nowhere else to go. Reconciliation mattered. Compensation could matter. Oaths mattered. Friends and relatives became involved. A feud was dangerous precisely because a single act of violence could spread through networks of loyalty. If a brother was injured, another brother might feel obliged to answer. A cousin joined, friends chose sides, an old disagreement returned. Medieval authorities often tried to prevent private conflict from becoming endless retaliation. Peace agreements could be formally arranged. Sureties were demanded. People promised good behaviour. In some legal systems, compensation for injury had deep roots, although practices changed substantially across the Middle Ages. The goal was sometimes less about changing an offender's personality and more about restoring order. Order was fragile. Even elite households carried weapons and rivalries inside their walls. A nobleman's hall might contain armed retainers. Servants loyal to different powerful families could meet at courts or gatherings. Knights were trained for violence. Their identity depended partly upon skill with weapons. Yet a knight was also expected, at least in idealized literature, to display restraint, loyalty, courage, and courtesy. The gap between the ideal and the person could be wide. Chivalric stories praised controlled strength because uncontrolled strength was a genuine problem. A lord with armed followers could intimidate neighbours. A feud between noble families might disrupt roads and villages. Private war, raiding, and revenge did not belong only to distant battlefields. They could enter farmland. A peasant had little interest in the magnificent language of honour when mounted men trampled crops. War itself often harmed people who had no part in deciding it. An army needed food, horses needed fodder. Soldiers passed through settlements. Some paid, others took. A village could lose grain, livestock, and tools without experiencing a formal battle. To the family watching a pig led away. The distinction between military supply and theft may have felt rather thin. Some chroniclers claimed armies behaved with astonishing brutality. Others praised particular commanders for discipline. Historians continue to debate how closely soldiers followed official rules in different campaigns. Much depended upon pay. Hungry unpaid troops were difficult to control. Mercenaries without employment could become especially feared. Yet violence was not confined to soldiers. Discipline within households could also be physical. A husband might strike a wife. A parent might beat a child. A master might hit a servant or apprentice. Medieval law and custom did not treat every act of domestic violence as a private horror requiring immediate removal from the household. Certain forms of physical correction were accepted. The boundaries were unclear. Excessive injury might bring legal intervention. Neighbours could complain. Family members might become involved. But the ordinary use of force inside hierarchical relationships was more tolerated than most modern listeners would accept. This did not mean those struck felt less pain. A child feared the rod. A servant resented a cruel master. A wife could fear an angry husband. Surviving petitions and court cases show people seeking help when violence became unbearable. But many stories were never written down. The oak door closed. The household remained together. Morning came, work resumed. Rough games added another kind of danger. Village festivals and urban celebrations could include wrestling, stick fighting, archery, football-like games, and contests of strength. Medieval football was not played with the careful boundaries of a modern field. Large groups might struggle to move a ball through streets or across countryside. Rules could be local and minimal. People were injured. Windows suffered. Authorities occasionally tried to prohibit such games. The prohibitions were often repeated. Again, repetition suggests enthusiasm survived regulation. Archery practice was encouraged in medieval England during particular periods because military authorities valued skilled bowmen. A bow was sport, labour, and military preparation at once. A boy learning to shoot at a target was also developing a skill capable of killing at distance. Hunting carried similar layers. For nobles, the hunt displayed status. Horses, dogs, servants, horns, and specialized knowledge surrounded the pursuit. A wounded boar could kill a person. A stag could injure dogs and hunters. The forest that appeared peaceful from the road became suddenly violent when animals were cornered. Hunting manuals described how to cut apart a carcass with careful ritual. Blood and hierarchy mixed. Different portions of the animal were distributed according to custom. Dogs received parts. Servants worked. The noble hunt transformed killing into ceremony. For poorer people, unauthorized hunting could itself become a crime. Forest laws protected elite privileges in certain regions. A hungry man taking a deer might face serious consequences. The moral distinction depended upon status. One person killed an animal as noble sport. Another killed the same animal and became a poacher. Now evening falls over a village green. A festival has ended. Trampled grass lies beneath fading light. Someone has a swollen eye from a wrestling match. Two young men are still being kept apart after an argument. An older woman gathers wooden cups near a bench. A dog searches hopefully beneath a table. Beyond the houses, a watchfire burns near the road. Watchmen existed because darkness changed the balance of safety. Town gates could close. Night watches moved through streets. Travellers arriving late might find themselves outside walls. A stranger on the road after dark invited suspicion. The watch listened for disorder, fire, thieves, fighting. In some towns, citizens shared obligations to guard gates or patrol streets. A watchman carried a staff, spear, or other weapon. His duty was to preserve peace through the visible possibility of force. That contradiction runs quietly through medieval life. Violence was feared. Violence was punished. Violence was preached against. And violence was also used to educate children, discipline servants, enforce laws, defend towns, settle honor, train warriors, hunt animals, and protect property. People condemned the wrong blow. They accepted the proper blow. The difficulty was deciding which was which. A lord called his violence justice. A father called his violence correction. A knight called his violence honor. A soldier called it duty. The injured person might have chosen a different word. The watchfire settles lower. Men stand beside it. Cloaks pulled close against the damp night. Beyond them, the road disappears between dark trees. Inside the village, doors are shut. Knives rest near beds or on tables because they will be needed tomorrow for bread, rope, leather, and work. A bow hangs from a wall. An axe waits near stacked wood. A staff leans beside the door. Ordinary tools, ordinary weapons. The medieval world did not always separate the two, and as the final bell moved across the sleeping roofs, peace settled gently over a society in which force was never very far away. Waiting in the hand, the law, the household, and the customs people had learned to call normal. And perhaps that is the strangest part of the medieval world. Not that people lived with cold rooms, shared beds, open drains, painful remedies, public punishment, dangerous roads, animal waste, and death close enough to hear through a church bell. The strangest part is that, for most of them, these things were not strange. A man waking beneath a wool blanket did not begin his morning by reflecting upon the extraordinary hardship of living without modern plumbing. He was thinking about the weather, the field, the ox, the rent owed to the manor, the ache in his tooth, whether there was enough bread, A woman carrying water from a well did not pause to imagine pipes hidden beneath distant future streets. She thought about the weight of the bucket, the fire that needed feeding. A child watching geese did not compare the danger of the road with a safer age yet to come. The child simply watched the geese. Normality is one of history's quietest powers. Human beings adapt. They arrange habits around discomfort. They inherit explanations from parents. They accept the shape of the world because, for a long time, no other shape has been visible. No one can quite agree where medieval endurance ended and resignation began. The sources rarely tell us. A chronicler might describe famine in a few lines before turning to the death of a king. A manor record might preserve the name of a tenant who failed to pay a fine but say nothing about the cold night he spent worrying before the court met. Monastic accounts record purchases of fish, wax, cloth, and medicine. They do not always preserve the sigh of the monk rising from bed when bells called him into a freezing cloister. History often keeps the object and loses the feeling. The wooden bowl survives, the tooth survives, the pilgrim badge survives, the complaint survives in a court roll, the person disappears. So we look at the remains and imagine horror. The dirt beneath rushes, the lice in clothing seams, the stranger sharing a bed at an inn, the healer lifting a blade toward a swollen vein, the child sent alone with animals, the body resting in a house before burial, the person standing in a pillory while neighbours watched. These things seem to demand a single question. How did anyone endure it? Yet medieval people would probably have asked questions about us as well. Perhaps they would wonder why so many people sleep alone, why neighbours can live beside one another for years without sharing bread, why the dead are carried quickly from familiar rooms, why bells no longer divide every day into a common rhythm, why so much food is discarded because a date has passed or a fruit carries a bruise, why animals that once lived beside human work have become invisible to many of the people who eat their meat. This does not make medieval hardship charming. There is no need to romanticize infection. Cold remains cold. A beating remains painful. Hunger is not made beautiful by candlelight. A dying child in a cottage was not suffering less because the church tower looked picturesque beneath winter snow. The past deserves more honesty than nostalgia. But honesty also asks us to see that medieval people were not endlessly horrified by their own lives. They loved. They complained. They laughed, though perhaps not as often in surviving documents as we would like. They gossiped at wells. They argued in markets. They saved good pieces of cloth. They worried over sick animals. They walked long roads to visit saints. They told stories beside fires. They watched weather gather over fields. They became accustomed to what surrounded them. Some chroniclers claimed particular generations were more sinful, softer, harsher, or less disciplined than those before them. The complaint is almost comforting in its familiarity. Even now, historians continue to debate how much ordinary life changed from century to century, because the Middle Ages lasted too long and covered too much land to fit into one simple portrait. A 13th century merchant in a great Italian city did not live like an 8th century farmer in a northern settlement. A wealthy abbess did not experience the world as a landless labourer. A castle kitchen worker knew a different winter from the lord sleeping behind bed curtains. Still, certain rhythms returned. The bell, the road, the fire, the field, the meal, the darkness. A medieval day began with duties waiting. Morning smoke lifted above roofs. People opened doors. Animals moved. Water was carried. Bread was cut. Tools were lifted. At midday, work paused where it could. At evening, people returned. Mud dried near the hearth. Hands reached toward bowls. Stories and complaints passed through familiar rooms. Then the light faded. Candles were expensive. Tallow smoked. Firewood had to last. Darkness encouraged rest. Perhaps this is where the medieval world feels closest to us tonight. Not in the filth, not in the punishments, not in the strange remedies or crowded churchyards, but in the final hour of the day. A person was tired. The work had been enough. Tomorrow contained worries that could not be solved before sleep. So the fire was left to settle. A cloak was hung. A child was quieted. A prayer was spoken. Someone listened to the wind, and the world became smaller. We can allow it to become smaller now as well. The market square is empty. No baker calls across the stalls. No cartwheels cut through the mud. The wooden stocks stand in darkness, no longer watched by a crowd. Rainwater moves slowly along the edge of the street and disappears beneath a bridge. Farther away, the pilgrimage road stretches between silent hedges. The travellers who walked it are gone. Their footprints have been covered by countless winters. A small roadside shrine leans beneath old trees. Perhaps once there were flowers before it. Perhaps a candle burned there while someone asked a saint for safe passage. No one can quite say. The forest beyond has changed. Trees fell. New trees grew. Paths moved. Villages vanished. Other villages became towns. The old manor house lost its roof. The abbey bells were silenced or replaced. Stone was taken from one wall and built into another. A carved beam became part of a barn. A broken pilgrim badge disappeared into soil. A comb fell beside a well and waited beneath the earth. Generations passed without knowing what objects lay below their feet. The people themselves moved into memory. The tooth puller, the alewife, the apprentice, the swineherd beneath the autumn trees, the monk rubbing cold hands before prayer, the woman carrying water, the child following larger footprints through frost. Each believed, as people often do, that the world around them was simply the world. They didn't know we would look back. They did not know which habits would horrify us. Perhaps that is why their ordinary lives remain so fascinating. The most unsettling things were rarely performed with theatrical cruelty. They happened while dinner cooked, while bells rang, while rain touched the roof. A shared bed was prepared. A wound was cauterized. A bucket was filled from a questionable stream. A child was sent to work. A body was washed for burial. Then someone stirred the pottage. The familiar and the horrifying occupied the same room. Slowly now, the last fire in that room is fading. The red glow beneath the ashes becomes dimmer. Beyond the oak door, moonlight rests over the road. The winter fields lie still. No carts are moving. No pilgrims are asking the way. Inside the abbey, one distant lamp burns near stone. Soon a bell will sound through the darkness. Its note will cross the cloister, pass above the wall, and move into the fields. For a moment, it will seem to belong to every sleeping village, every castle chamber, every cottage beneath soot-dark rafters, every old road disappearing into mist. Then the note will fade, just as voices fade, just as footsteps fade, just as the habits of one age become the mysteries of another. The medieval world can remain there tonight, behind us now, quiet, cold perhaps, but distant, its fires sinking low, its doors closed, its people sleeping beneath wool and linen, unaware that centuries are already waiting beyond their dreams. And here, in the softer darkness of the present, there is nothing more you need to carry from their world. The roads can empty, the bells can grow distant, the market can sleep. Let the stone churches fade into mist. Let the candlelit halls become shadows. Let the last watchfire settle into ash. Time will continue its long, patient movement, generation after generation, winter after winter, until even the loudest footsteps are quiet. For now, rest. The journey is finished, the old villagers are sleeping, and you may sleep too.